The hallway is quiet at this hour, and the runner beneath your feet swallows the sound of footsteps the way it was always meant to. Somewhere above, a housemaid is turning down a bed that will never be slept in tonight. The air smells of beeswax polish and faintly of the lilies that were replaced only this morning. You have walked this corridor before in daylight, with a guide reciting dates. But now the guide is gone, and the rope that usually cordons off the family's private rooms has been lifted, and the house feels less like a museum and more like something that is only pretending to be asleep. There is a panel in the wall ahead of you. You would not have noticed it this afternoon, not with the crowd moving past, not with the docent's voice filling the room. But now, in the low gold light of a single lamp left burning for the night watchman, you can see the seam, a hairline, a place where the wallpaper does not quite match itself. This is where the story begins tonight, not with a name or a date, but with a door that was built to be forgotten. Somewhere behind it, a woman once kept the only things in her life that belonged entirely to her. Let the hallway hold you a moment longer. There is no need to hurry toward the answer. The house has kept this secret for over a century. It can keep it a little longer while you settle in, while your shoulders loosen, while the weight of the day finally begins to leave your body. You are standing at the threshold of the Gilded Age, that stretch of American decades between the Civil War and the First World War, when fortunes rose faster than any single lifetime could reasonably explain, and when the men who built those fortunes built houses to match them, 70-room cottages in Newport that were only ever occupied 8 weeks a year, Fifth Avenue mansions with ballrooms sized for 400 guests, because 400 was, for a time, the precise number of people who were considered to exist. These houses were built to be seen. Every facade, every marble column, every gate wrought in iron and gilded in gold leaf was a sentence in a language everyone of that era could read fluently. We have arrived, we are permanent, we are beyond question. But a house built entirely to be seen needs, somewhere within it, a place that cannot be. Every visible thing requires an invisible counterpart. Every performance needs a wing. So the architects built them. Sliding panels disguised as bookcases, closets set flush into panelled walls, their outlines lost in the pattern of the wood grain. Back staircases so narrow that 2 people could not pass without one turning sideways, built specifically so the family upstairs would never have to witness the labour that made their lives possible. Passages beneath the gardens, doors behind portraits, rooms that appeared on no floor plan shown to guests and sometimes on no floor plan at all. Officially, most of these spaces existed for the servants. This is true, and we will spend time in that truth, because the geography of servitude is its own kind of story, and it deserves to be told slowly. But tonight we are interested in a second population of these hidden spaces, smaller, quieter, almost never mentioned in the guidebooks. The rooms, closets and drawers that the women of these houses claimed for themselves. Because here is the thing about a Gilded Age wife that the marble columns never advertised. However grand her house, however many zeros followed the number of her husband's fortune, she often owned almost nothing outright. Her jewellery might be entailed, her allowance might be set by a trustee she had never met, her correspondence might be read before it reached her. She lived inside the most visible architecture in America, and she was, in the most literal legal sense of the era, one of the least visible people within it. A secret room, then, was not simply a curiosity of Gilded Age design. For the woman who found one, or asked for one, or simply claimed one that already existed, it could become the only square footage in her life that operated by her own rules. A place to keep a diary her husband did not read, a place to keep money that was, however briefly, entirely her own. A place to grieve a child without an audience, a place to plan an escape that would take years to complete. Tonight we will walk through several such rooms, real ones, documented in the surviving records of real houses. We will move slowly the way the women who used them had to move, because everything about their lives required patience measured in seasons, not days. There is no need to hold on to any of it. Let the details drift past the way lamplight drifts across a hallway. You're only here to listen. The best hidden doors were never actually hidden from the people who built them. A carpenter working in 1890 knew exactly where every seam in a mansion lay, because his hands had cut and fitted every board. The secrecy was never structural, it was social. A door became invisible not through some trick of engineering, but through an agreement, unspoken but universal, that certain people would simply never be shown where to look. In one great house on the edge of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a family dining room holds a wall of panelling behind the breakfast table, and set into that panelling, disguised by the repeating pattern of carved wood, is a door. It leads to the butler's pantry, where the china was counted and the silver was polished, and where, on any given morning, a dozen small domestic dramas unfolded that the family upstairs never had reason to imagine. Push on the correct panel and the wall gives way. To a guest seated at breakfast, it was simply a wall. To the staff, it was a road they travelled 100 times a day. Nearby, beside a great stone fireplace in a smoking room reserved for the men of the house and their cigars, another door waits behind a hinge disguised as moulding. It leads deeper into the house, toward rooms that were never meant to be photographed, never meant to appear in any guidebook a visitor might later purchase in the gift shop. The men who used that door for brandy and conversation rarely thought about where else it might lead, or who else might know its combination of pressure and give. There is a trapdoor in the floor of a winter garden, where tropical plants were kept alive through frozen months by pipes hidden beneath the tile, and in the owner's own bedroom, a concealed closet, built flush with the wall and papered to disappear into it entirely, holds nothing more dramatic today than dust and the memory of whatever it once held. No plaque tells you what was kept there. The house was not built to answer that question. It was built to make sure the question was never asked in the first place. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something essential about the era before we go any further. The wealthy of the Gilded Age did not simply want privacy. Anyone can want privacy. They wanted architecture that made the very existence of a boundary invisible to the people on the other side of it. A locked door announces itself. A door that looks like a wall announces nothing at all. It simply is the wall, until the day someone who knows better leans their weight against the correct spot. Think for a moment about what it means to live inside a house built on that principle. Every room you enter might have another room folded inside it, unseen. Every wall you lean against might, under different pressure, swing open onto a version of the house that was never meant for you. For the mistress of such a house, this was not an abstraction. She'd grown up more often than not in homes far smaller, where every room served one visible purpose and nothing more. She married into architecture that concealed itself from her by design, in a home that was legally hers to preside over and only rarely hers to fully understand. The staircases tell a version of the same story, though they are less romantic to discuss than trapdoors and panelled walls. In the largest of the Newport cottages, a narrow back staircase rises through the house from the basement kitchens to the servants' quarters on the uppermost floor, built deliberately out of sight of the family's main rooms. Two people could not pass each other on it without one turning sideways against the wall. It was not designed for comfort. It was designed for invisibility, so that a housemaid carrying linens or a footman carrying coal could move through the entire vertical span of the house without once crossing the eye line of the people they served. Beneath several of these mansions, stone tunnels connect outbuildings to the main house, corridors built so that deliveries, coal, ice, and eventually early electrical equipment could move through the property without disturbing the manicured surface above. Visitors today can walk portions of these tunnels on specialized tours that did not exist, of course, for the families who once lived above them. The tunnels were never a secret exactly. They were simply beneath consideration the way plumbing is beneath consideration until the day it stops working. What strikes you, walking this hallway now in the low evening light, is how much design work went into making an entire category of human movement disappear. Servants disappearing into walls, deliveries disappearing beneath gardens, labour disappearing into architecture so thoroughly that a guest could spend an entire evening in one of these houses and never once glimpse the machinery that kept the candles lit and the champagne cold. And it is this same logic, applied to labour and to class, that we will trace tonight into a quieter and more private corner. Because if a house could be built to disappear its servants, it could just as easily disappear other things. Other people, in a sense. A wife's private correspondence, a wife's small savings, a wife's grief. The architecture of concealment did not stop at the servants' stairs. It simply changed its purpose, room by room, as it climbed toward the family's own quarters. Consider the woman standing at her dressing table on an ordinary Tuesday morning, Her husband already gone to his office downtown, her children with their governess in another wing entirely. She is, by any outward measure, the most visible woman in the city. Her name appears in the society columns. Her gowns are described in detail by reporters who are never actually invited to see them worn. And yet the house around her holds spaces she may never have been shown, spaces her husband commissioned without consulting her, because the deed, the mortgage, and very often the marriage itself were arranged in ways that made consultation unnecessary. She does not know, this particular morning, that a door exists behind the panelling of the room down the hall. She's walked past that wall 1,000 times. She has never once felt the seam beneath her fingers, because she has never had reason to run her hand along that particular stretch of moulding, searching. That will come later, if it comes at all. For now, the wall is simply a wall to her, exactly as it was designed to be. This is the strange intimacy of a house built to conceal. It does not conceal from strangers. Strangers are kept out entirely by gates and staff and calling cards. It conceals from the people who live inside it every day, from the family members who trust the walls around them precisely because those walls have never given them reason not to. The concealment happens in plain sight, inside the most private rooms of a person's own life. We will return to this house, and to others like it, more than once tonight. Each time we'll look a little more closely at what a hidden room was actually for, not in the servant's understanding of the term, but in the quieter, more guarded understanding of the women who sometimes discovered or built or were finally shown a space that belonged to no one's ledger but their own. For now, let the image settle, a house with 100 rooms and somewhere inside it, one more room that does not appear on any plan, a door shaped exactly like a wall, a woman standing nearby who does not yet know it is there. The candle in the hallway gutters slightly, though there is no draught you can feel. Somewhere above you, the housemaid has finished turning down the bed no one will sleep in. The house settles the way old houses do, a long, slow exhale through timber and stone, and the evening deepens by another shade of gold. Move with me now to Newport, Rhode Island, in the closing years of the 19th century, where a 50-room summer cottage stands on Bellevue Avenue behind wrought-iron gates, its facade modelled loosely on a French palace, its interior lined with more marble than had ever before been imported for a private residence in America. From the street, the house presents exactly 2 stories, a temple front portico, a scale meant to recall the grandeur of a royal residence, rather than a summer home used 8 or 10 weeks a year. But the house is not 2 stories, it is 4. Below the ground floor, hidden beneath the lawn's gentle slope, sits a working kitchen and a warren of service rooms, invisible from every angle a guest might approach the house. And above the 2 ground floors that guests actually saw, the ones containing the gold ballroom and the formal dining room and the bedrooms furnished for the family, there rises a 3rd residential floor entirely concealed from the exterior silhouette. This is where the servants lived. You would not know it was there unless someone told you. The roofline was designed specifically to hide it, the windows tucked beneath the cornice in a way that reads, from the lawn below, as decorative rather than functional. An entire population of the household, 30 or more people at the height of the season, existed in a floor that the architecture itself had been instructed to deny. Sit with that fact for a moment, because it is not an incidental detail. It is the organising principle of the entire house. Every design decision, from the placement of the servants' stairs to the height of the hidden windows, existed to answer one question. How do we build a home in which an entire class of human beings can be present and invisible at the same time? The mistress of such a house occupied a curious middle position in this architecture. She was not concealed the way the servants were. Her name appeared on invitations, her portrait might hang in the front hall. But she was, in her own way, subject to a different kind of concealment, one that operated not through hidden flaws but through hidden information. She knew every room in the house that guests were permitted to see. She often knew a great deal less about the rooms where the actual decisions about that house, its finances, its future, its very ownership were made. In more than one of these Newport houses, the deed itself tells a story rarely mentioned on the guided tour. One mansion was given outright to its mistress as a birthday present from her husband, a gesture so lavish it made newspapers across the country. 50 rooms, a temple front, 500,000 cubic feet of marble, presented as a gift the way a smaller husband might present a bracelet. And yet the gesture, however grand, didn't change the deeper architecture of her life. A house given as a present is still a house someone else chose to give. When that marriage eventually dissolved, years later, the woman who had received the mansion as a birthday gift found herself for the first time in her adult life the sole and undisputed owner of something enormous, not shared, not managed on her behalf by a trustee or a husband, simply hers on paper in a way that very few women of her era ever experienced. She would go on to use that ownership in ways no one who gave her the house could have anticipated, opening its grounds to gatherings that had nothing to do with dinner parties and everything to do with a cause the polite society around her found deeply uncomfortable. We will come back to her later in the evening when the house grows quieter and there is more room to sit with what she did next. For now, notice only this. Ownership in the Gilded Age was rarely a simple fact. It was a layered thing, full of exceptions and contingencies, gifts that came with invisible strings, deeds that technically belonged to a wife but whose management remained, by custom if not always by law, in a husband's hands. A woman could stand in the grandest room of the grandest house on the most fashionable street in America and still not be entirely certain what precisely was hers. This uncertainty shaped the way many of these women moved through their own homes. Some grew accustomed to a kind of practiced ignorance, an agreement, never spoken aloud, to simply not ask certain questions. Others developed a quieter, more private form of vigilance, learning which drawers held which papers, which rooms their husbands preferred to keep closed, which conversations stopped abruptly when they entered a room. It was not paranoia. It was pattern recognition, the same instinct any person develops when the information they need is being managed by someone else. The back staircases we discussed a moment ago were not only pathways for servants. In several documented cases they became pathways for wives as well, particularly late at night, when a woman wished to move through her own house without being seen or heard by a husband entertaining guests she did not wish to face, or by a household staff whose gossip travelled faster than any newspaper. The narrow stairs built to make one class of person invisible became, in these quieter moments, useful to a woman seeking the same thing for entirely different reasons. There is something almost tender in this detail if you sit with it long enough. A staircase built by men for the purpose of erasing servants from view, repurposed by the lady of the house as her own means of disappearing. The Architecture of Concealment did not care who used it. It simply offered the same gift, invisibility, to whoever needed it enough to climb those narrow, uncomfortable stairs in the dark. Consider too the smaller concealments that did not require architecture at all. A jewellery box with a false bottom, purchased quietly from a jeweller who understood exactly what was being requested and never asked why. A writing desk with a drawer that appeared to any casual observer slightly too shallow for its exterior dimensions, the missing depth accounted for by a hidden compartment behind a sliding panel. These were not the province of the very wealthy alone. Furniture makers of the era produced them in enough quantity that a woman of even modest means might own one, tucked into a bedroom corner, holding whatever she considered worth protecting from view. What did these small hidden compartments typically hold? The historical record, fragmentary as it is on matters this private, suggests a fairly consistent list across many households. Letters, first, and most often, correspondence from before a marriage, or from a friendship a husband disapproved of, or from a sister or a mother whose political opinions did not match the household's public positions. Small amounts of cash, saved slowly, dollar by dollar, from allowances that were otherwise entirely accounted for. Occasionally, documents, a will drafted independently, a deed to a small property purchased quietly under a different name, evidence of a financial independence a woman was building without her husband's knowledge, one careful transaction at a time. None of this was necessarily deceptive in the way the word might suggest to modern ears. In a legal and social system that gave a wife so little unquestioned ownership over anything, a hidden drawer was not a betrayal of trust. It was closer to a survival instinct, the same instinct that leads any person, in any era, to keep a small reserve of resources set aside against a future they cannot fully predict. The third floor of that Newport mansion still stands today, its hidden windows tucked beneath the cornice exactly as they were designed to be. Visitors on the specialized tour can climb the same narrow stairs the servants once climbed, can stand in the small plain rooms where an entire invisible population once lived out their working lives. It is, in its own way, a kind of memorial, though no one designed it to be one. The house simply outlasted the intentions of the people who built it, and in outlasting them, it became something closer to a record. Let the image rest here a while, a house with a hidden floor, and inside that house, a woman who owned it and did not fully own it at the same time, walking rooms she understood only partially, keeping whatever small things she could keep in whatever small spaces she could find. The candle gutters again. The hour is growing later. There is no need to follow the thought any further tonight. Simply let it settle, the way sediment settles, quietly, at the bottom of something still. Before we can understand what a woman might hide inside her own home, we need to understand what the law of the era had already decided she was not permitted to know. This is not a digression. It is the foundation everything else in tonight's story rests upon, so let it settle slowly, the way the deep parts of a story always should. For most of the 19th century, a married woman in the United States existed under a legal doctrine inherited from English common law, a doctrine that held her legal identity to be absorbed entirely into her husband's the moment she married. She could not, in most states for most of the era, sign a contract in her own name. She could not file a lawsuit without her husband's participation. Her wages, if she earned any, belonged to him by default. Her inheritance, if she received one, was typically placed under his management or the management of a trustee he approved of. Reformers spent decades chipping away at this arrangement. Married Women's Property Acts passed state by state beginning in the middle of the century, granting wives the right to hold property they brought into a marriage, and later the right to control their own earnings. By the time our story reaches its fullest bloom, in the 1880s and 90s, a wealthy bride could, in theory, keep her own fortune separate from her husband's. In theory. In practice, the money still travelled through a maze of arrangements designed, whether intentionally or simply by long habit, to keep her at a comfortable distance from the details. A young woman's inheritance was placed in trust. The trust was managed by a trustee, who was very often her father, or her brother, or a business partner of her new husband's. That trustee decided what she could spend, and just as importantly, what she needed to be told. Picture the mechanics of it for a moment, the way you might picture the machinery hidden behind one of those panelled walls. A wealthy man of this era might control a dozen different financial entities at once: a railroad holding company, a trust established for his wife's inheritance, a brokerage account, a real estate partnership. The paperwork alone filled entire rooms, entire floors of clerks copying figures by hand into ledgers bound in leather. And the wife, more often than not, saw none of it. She did not receive quarterly statements. She did not review balance sheets. She did not sit in on the meetings where decisions about her own money were quietly made. If she asked too many questions, she risked being seen not as prudent, but as unfeminine, as violating an unspoken bargain that ran through her entire social class. He provided, she displayed. He managed the money, she managed the household, the guest lists, the correct number of courses at dinner. Her work was to spend with confidence and taste. His work, mostly invisible to her, was to make sure there was something behind that confidence to spend. So imagine now the writing desk. Every grand bedroom in every one of these houses contained one, a place for correspondence, for household accounts, for the small daily paperwork of managing a large staff. And imagine a woman seated at that desk on a quiet afternoon, keeping her own private ledger, not of the family's true finances, which she could not access, but of what she did know. Her allowance, her small personal accounts, the occasional gift of cash from a father or brother who had not yet fully absorbed the idea that she needed permission to hold it. This private ledger, kept in a locked drawer or a hidden compartment, was often the only financial document in the entire house that a wife controlled from beginning to end. Every entry was hers. Every number was one she had verified with her own hand, rather than accepted second-hand from a husband or a trustee. In a life defined by financial fog, it was a small patch of clarity, however modest the sums involved. Some women used these private accounts for nothing more dramatic than dress fittings and calling cards. Others used them more deliberately, setting aside small amounts month after month, building a reserve that had nothing to do with luxury and everything to do with the quiet, unglamorous math of independence: a train ticket, a modest apartment should the need ever arise, a lawyer's retainer kept ready in case a marriage someday required the kind of exit that could not be arranged without money already in hand. We know this pattern existed because it surfaces again and again in the documented histories of the era's most examined marriages that eventually ended in divorce, in scandal, or in a widow's sudden discovery of just how little she had actually understood. A woman named Mary married for decades to a financier who built and lost fortunes with equal speed, discovered only after his death that the safe in her own home held documents she had never been permitted to see, records that revealed her husband had been quietly liquidating assets nearly a decade before she suspected anything was wrong. She had lived inside a fortune that had, in the most literal sense, already ceased to exist, and no one had told her. That discovery, when it finally came, arrived not through a conversation, but through a locksmith. The safe would not open with any combination she knew, because she had never been given one. She had to call a stranger into her own home to drill through a lock that had kept her, specifically, out of her own life's finances for years. Think about what that means. A woman standing in a room she owned, waiting for a man she had never met to break open a box that had been sitting in her house the entire time, holding the truth about a marriage she had lived inside for decades. We will return to her story more fully later tonight, because it deserves the space. For now, simply notice the shape of the pattern. A locked safe in a wife's own home, a private ledger kept in a hidden drawer. A trust managed by men she had never elected and could not remove. Layer upon layer of concealment, some built into the walls, some built into the law itself, all of it converging on the same quiet truth. A Gilded Age wife's ignorance of her own financial life was very often not an accident. It was, in a sense no one would have described so plainly at the time, the intended design. And yet within that design, small acts of quiet resistance persisted. A ledger kept faithfully in a locked drawer, a modest sum saved dollar by dollar against a future no one else believed she needed to prepare for. A letter from a lawyer, tucked behind the false bottom of a jewellery box, its contents known to no one but the woman who had commissioned it. None of these acts changed the larger structure, but they mattered enormously to the individual women who performed them, the way a single lit window matters to someone walking home through a dark and unfamiliar street. The desk in front of you, the one in this house you're walking through tonight, is empty now, of course. Its drawers hold nothing but the faint smell of old wood and older paper, but if you rest your hand against its surface, you can almost feel the weight of what it once held, page after careful page of a woman's private accounting, kept in a hand no one else was ever meant to read. Let your breathing slow to match the pace of this room. There's nothing more to solve here tonight, only more to notice, more to let settle, as the house around you continues its long, patient exhale into the dark. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. Let us walk back now toward the marble house we paused beside earlier, because its story deserves more than the passing glance we gave it. In the closing years of the 1880s, a wealthy railroad heir commissioned a summer cottage for his wife on Bellevue Avenue, a house built loosely in the style of a French palace, its scale intended to rival, and in some respects surpass, the grandest private residences yet built in America. The house took 4 years to complete, 50 rooms, 500,000 cubic feet of marble, shipped and carved and set into place by a small army of craftsmen. When it was finished, the husband presented it to his wife not as a shared asset, not as a family estate, but as a personal gift, a birthday present marking her 39th year. The newspapers of the day found this detail irresistible and printed it accordingly. A 50-room marble palace, wrapped, in the public imagination if not literally, in ribbon. There is something worth sitting with in the strangeness of that gesture. A birthday present is, by definition, something given freely, without expectation of return, a small token of affection scaled up in this case to almost unimaginable proportions. And yet the house, however genuinely intended as a gift, arrived within a marriage that was, by most surviving accounts, already showing the particular kind of strain common to unions arranged as much for social advancement as for affection. The wife who received this house was, by the standards of her era, an unusually forceful presence in a world that preferred its women decorative. She had orchestrated, several years earlier, one of the most talked about social manoeuvres of the entire Gilded Age, engineering her own family's acceptance into the uppermost tier of New York society through a costume ball so lavish and so strategically guest-listed that even the reigning queen of that society found herself compelled to attend, and in attending to formally acknowledge a family she'd previously refused to recognise. This was not the behaviour of a woman content to simply display herself at her husband's direction. It was the behaviour of someone who understood, perhaps more clearly than most of her peers, that social position in this era was not inherited so much as constructed, room by room, invitation by invitation, the same way the mansions themselves were constructed, marble block by marble block, until the finished structure looked as though it had simply always existed. The marriage that produced her birthday present mansion did not last. Within a handful of years she filed for divorce, an act so socially radical for a woman of her position that it made front pages across the country, not for the accusations involved, though there were several, but simply for the fact that a woman of her standing had chosen to end a marriage rather than endure it. Divorce, in this world, was understood as something that happened to women, when it happened at all, rarely something a woman initiated and even more rarely something she survived socially. She survived it. More than survived it, in fact. Because the house, given to her outright years earlier as a gift with no strings her husband had thought to attach, remained legally and unambiguously hers. When the marriage ended, she did not lose her home the way so many divorced women of her era lost everything that had once seemed to belong to them. She kept the marble palace, kept the 50 rooms, kept the temple front portico that had once been intended purely as a demonstration of her husband's wealth and taste. For a time, she left the house closed, moving instead into a residence belonging to the man she would soon marry. But years later, after that second husband died, she returned to her marble palace and reopened it, this time entirely on her own terms, as the sole mistress of a house that had begun its life as a symbolic gift and had become, through the ordinary unpredictability of a life fully lived, something closer to a genuine possession. It was during this later period that the house's most quietly radical use began. On the seaside cliff behind the mansion, she commissioned a small ornamental structure, a tea house in the Chinese style, delicate and pagoda-roofed, the kind of garden folly that wealthy families across the era built purely for aesthetic pleasure, a place to take afternoon refreshment with a view of the water. It was, on its surface, one more decorative flourish in a house already overflowing with them. But she used it for something else entirely. In the years following her second husband's death, she became one of the most significant financial supporters of the movement to secure women the right to vote, and she opened the grounds of her marble palace, including that small ornamental tea house, to suffrage rallies and strategy meetings that drew activists from across the country. Guests who had once come to admire her gowns now came to organise a political movement that would, within a handful of years, fundamentally rewrite the legal status of every woman in America. Picture that scene for a moment, because it deserves to be pictured slowly. A house built as a birthday gift, in a marriage arranged as much for advancement as for love, in an era when a wife could not sign a contract or control her own inheritance without a man's approval, becomes, decades later, a headquarters for the campaign to end exactly that arrangement. The same marble walls that were meant to announce a husband's success came, eventually, to shelter a movement dedicated to making a wife's success possible on her own terms. There is no single hidden room in this story, no locked drawer or false-bottom jewellery box. The concealment here operated differently, hidden not behind panelling, but behind the ordinary assumptions of the people who watched her life unfold. No one who read about a 50-room birthday present in 1892 could have predicted the tea house on the cliff, or the rallies held beneath its small pagoda roof, or the quiet, patient decades it took to get from one to the other. This is, in its own way, the truest kind of secret room. Not a space cut into a wall, but a future folded invisibly into a present moment, waiting to be discovered only by the person patient enough and determined enough to eventually claim it. The house did not change, its owner did, and in changing she turned a monument to her husband's wealth into something he could never have anticipated giving her. Consider, as you rest here, how many of the women in tonight's story were engaged in some version of this same quiet transformation, taking spaces and objects that were given to them for one purpose, and slowly, patiently, over years, no one else was watching closely enough to notice, turning them into something else entirely. It rarely happened quickly. It rarely happened publicly until it was already finished. The tide outside the Marble Palace continues its slow work against the cliffs below the tea house, exactly as it has for longer than the house itself has existed, exactly as it will long after every name in tonight's story has faded from the guidebooks. There is a comfort in that continuity, if you let yourself feel it. Some things outlast every fortune built to contain them. There is a house on Fifth Avenue in this story, though it no longer stands. Where its platinum-plated doors once opened onto one of the most photographed entrance halls in New York, a garden grows today, ordinary and unremarkable the way gardens are. But for a handful of decades at the turn of the century, this house held one of the era's most spectacular financial illusions, and at its centre, a wife who spent 30 years without ever being shown the truth behind it. Her husband had built and lost and rebuilt fortunes across a career that began in municipal bonds, collapsed in a prison sentence for embezzlement, and rose again through streetcar franchises in a rapidly growing Midwestern city. By the time the family relocated to New York in the final years of the 19th century, he had assembled an art collection that included works by some of Europe's most celebrated painters, funded an observatory that would house the largest refracting telescope in the world, and built a mansion whose front doors were plated not in gold but in platinum, a detail so unusual that it became, for a time, one of the most discussed features of any private home in the city. The wife who presided over this house had married him decades earlier, as a teenager, standing by him through the early disgrace of his prison sentence with a loyalty that never wavered publicly, whatever it may have cost her privately. She hosted the dinners, she wore the gowns, she performed night after night, season after season, the role of a devoted and gracious hostess to a household that appeared, from every visible angle, to be built on an unshakable fortune. It was not. Behind the platinum doors, behind the gallery of old masters, a structure of debt had been quietly accumulating for years, loans taken against the mansion, against the art collection, against railroad holdings, all of it funding an ambitious and expensive new venture in the electrification of London's Underground Railway. Every dollar of visible wealth was, by the final years of the marriage, backed by several dollars of obligation to someone else. The house that looked like permanence was, in the plainest financial terms, a structure of borrowed time. She did not know this. She could not have known it, not through any failure of attention or intelligence on her part, but because the entire architecture of her financial life had been built, deliberately or simply through decades of habit, to keep this specific category of information away from her. She did not receive account statements. She was not present for conversations with bankers or trustees. Her role, as defined by the world she had married into, was to spend with confidence, not to audit. In the autumn of a year in the early 1900s, while her husband lay ill in London, she did something that many women of her position and era simply never did. She hired a locksmith to open the safe inside her own home, because the combination, like so much else about the family's true finances, had never been shared with her. Sit with that image for a moment, because it deserves the full weight of its strangeness. A woman standing in a room she owned, in a house that bore her name in every society column in the city, waiting for a stranger to drill through a lock that had been keeping her out of her own life. What she found inside, once the tumblers finally gave way, was a bill of sale dated nearly a decade earlier, evidence that her husband had been quietly liquidating certain assets years before anyone around her suspected the fortune was under any strain at all. It was the first loose thread in a much larger unravelling, and once she began pulling it, the rest of the structure came apart with astonishing speed. She took the documents to lawyers. She requested, for the first time in a marriage spanning decades, access to bank records and trust documents, and corporate filings she had never previously been permitted to see. And the picture that slowly emerged, piece by careful piece, was catastrophic. The mansion was mortgaged. The art collection, those celebrated paintings that hung on the walls like banners of permanence, had been pledged as collateral for loans. The railroad holdings were gone, sold or pledged elsewhere in a tangle so complex that separating the family's actual assets from its debts proved nearly impossible. Her husband died that December. The newspapers announced, in the confident language of obituary writers working from outdated assumptions, that he had died worth a fortune in the tens of millions. It took the lawyers only a matter of weeks to determine the truth. Once every debt was accounted for, what remained of that fortune was worth barely a fraction of what the public believed, a number so far below the reported figure that it barely registered as wealth at all by the standards of the world she had spent 30 years living inside. What does it feel like to discover in your late 40s that your entire adult life had been financed by an illusion someone else was maintaining on your behalf, without your knowledge or consent? We do not have her private diary from those weeks, if she kept one at all. We have only the public record, the legal filings, the auction notices for a collection of paintings that were sold within months to cover debts she had never known existed. But the shape of the experience is not hard to imagine if you allow yourself the quiet effort of imagining it. There is a version of this story that ends simply with loss, and it would not be an inaccurate version. The house was eventually sold. The art was dispersed to collectors who recognized a distress sale when they saw one. The household staff, who had served the family for years, were dismissed, and the bills from caterers and dressmakers and florists continued arriving for months afterward, addressed to a household that technically no longer existed in any financial sense. But there is another detail worth holding on to here, smaller and quieter than the collapse itself. Once she finally had access to the truth, however painful that truth turned out to be, she used it. She hired her own lawyers. She conducted her own investigation. She did not simply accept whatever settlement the estate's executors initially offered her. For the first time in 3 decades, she behaved not as a hostess managing a household's appearance, but as an auditor managing her own interests, and however limited her options ultimately proved to be, that shift in posture, from passive to active, from decorated to determined, mattered. The observatory her husband funded still stands today in the American Midwest, its telescope still, by most measures, among the largest refracting instruments ever built. It was, by most accounts, the one asset in his entire portfolio that was never leveraged, never mortgaged, never pledged as collateral against some other ambition. A gift given outright, with no strings attached, ironically to an institution rather than to the wife who had spent 30 years believing herself the primary beneficiary of everything he had built. The house on Fifth Avenue is gone now, replaced by that quiet, unremarkable garden. But somewhere in the historical record, in the legal filings and the auction catalogues, and the brief newspaper items that eventually replaced admiration with something closer to pity, her story survives. A reminder of exactly how much architecture, financial and literal, once existed to keep a wife at a careful, engineered distance from the truth of her own life. Let the weight of that story settle now, the way weight always eventually settles. There's nothing more you need to carry forward from it tonight except the shape of the pattern, which we will see again in different houses, with different names, before this story is through. Cross the ocean with me now to a palace of pink marble on a wide Parisian avenue, built by a French count for the American heiress he had married for her fortune, and abandoned in the space of a single afternoon by the wife who finally understood exactly what she had married into. She was the daughter of one of America's great railroad fortunes, 20 years old and unusually shy when a titled Frenchman began courting her with the practiced charm of a man who had studied, quite deliberately, exactly which American heiress might fund the life he intended to live. He was not without genuine appeal. He spoke of Paris, of art, of a world beyond the heavy brownstone propriety of her family's circle in New York. Her family objected. She married him anyway. Within weeks of the wedding, she was living in Paris, and within a remarkably short time after that, her husband had begun spending her inheritance at a pace that defied ordinary comprehension. He rented a mansion that had once belonged to a hairdresser of the doomed French Queen Marie Antoinette, found it insufficient, and built instead a private palace on the Avenue Foch, its facade clad in pink marble, modelled loosely on one of the smaller palaces at Versailles. He purchased 2 country estates. He acquired a yacht with a crew of 100 men. He hosted parties that were, even by the extravagant standards of Parisian society, legendary. The geography of the marriage was, in its own way, a kind of architecture of concealment, though it required no hidden panels or false-bottom drawers. Simple distance did the work instead. Her family's trustees in New York could not easily monitor transactions made in Paris. Cables took days to arrive. Accountings took months to compile and verify. By the time any warning could reach her, the money in question had usually already been spent, converted into marble, into tapestry, into an evening's entertainment that guests would forget by morning, but that had cost in a single night more than most American families earned across several years. She knew portions of what was happening, of course. She signed checks. She reviewed budgets, or at least was shown budgets that had already been shaped to seem reasonable. But the full scale of the spending, the slow and steady erosion of a fortune that had once seemed inexhaustible, remained hidden from her in the complexity of French banking, in the language barrier she never fully overcame, in the simple social expectation that a wife of her position did not audit her husband as though he were a household clerk. By the early years of the new century, French courts reviewing the family's finances at her brother's insistence found that her husband had spent an amount so large it strained ordinary belief, the equivalent in modern terms of several $100 million across little more than a decade. Flowers alone for a single reception had cost more than most families spent on housing in a year. A single piece of antique furniture, acquired for a hallway few guests ever entered, cost more than a factory worker's decade of wages. And still, for years, she stayed. There were 5 children by this point, and under French law of the era, custody in the event of a divorce leaned heavily toward the father, particularly when the mother in question was a foreign-born wife facing French judges in a French court. Her husband understood this leverage perfectly well, and used it, deliberately and without apparent hesitation, to keep her bound to a marriage that had long since become, in every meaningful sense, a one-directional transfer of wealth from her family to his ambitions. What finally broke the arrangement was not a single dramatic confrontation, but a quiet, meticulously planned afternoon. Knowing her husband would be occupied at a legislative session, she hired a team of workers in secret, gathered her children, and emptied the palace entirely. Every stick of furniture, every tapestry, every trace of the household she had spent more than a decade maintaining. She changed the locks. When her husband returned that evening, he found a house as hollow as the marriage it had always represented, the marble walls standing exactly where they had always stood, containing, for the first time since the day they were built, absolutely nothing at all. It was not a separation in any conventional sense. It was closer to an evacuation, executed with a precision and a patience that suggests she had been planning it in some quiet corner of her mind for far longer than anyone around her had realized. The palace of pink marble, built to demonstrate her husband's inherited grandeur, became instead a monument to the exact moment a woman finally, decisively, stopped funding a fiction. The divorce proceedings that followed laid the full accounting bare in French courtrooms that had, by most accounts, seen aristocratic excess before, but rarely anything quite so thoroughly documented. Her husband did not deny the spending. He explained it, framing an entire decade of extraction as simply the natural expression of his family's 400-year history, a heritage he insisted could not be lived cheaply, any more than a fish could be expected to live comfortably on dry land. The courts were not persuaded by the metaphor. The divorce was granted. She retained custody of the children, though the legal battle over them stretched on for additional years, her husband using every available lever of French sympathy for an aristocrat facing a wealthy foreign wife. Years later, her former husband published a memoir, its title translating roughly to a meditation on the art of living without money, the final gesture of a man who had spent an extraordinary fortune that was never his, and who apparently considered the greatest tragedy of his life to be the day the supply was finally cut off. It is worth noting, if only for the strange symmetry of it, that the palace of pink marble stood on the Avenue Foch for decades after the divorce, its facade slowly greying in the Paris rain, until it was finally demolished in the late 1960s and replaced in the end by an ordinary parking lot. What can we take from an afternoon like that one so many decades later, tucked into a story we are telling tonight primarily to help you rest? Perhaps only this. The most decisive room in this entire story was not a hidden panel or a false-bottomed drawer. It was an empty palace, stripped bare in a single afternoon by a woman who had spent over a decade learning, piece by painful piece, exactly what her marriage had cost her, and who finally, when she'd learned enough, acted on that knowledge with a precision that surprised everyone who thought they knew her. There is no violence in this image, no confrontation, no raised voices across a marble hallway. There is only the quiet, methodical work of hired movers carrying furniture out through doors that had once been locked against her own scrutiny, and a woman standing somewhere nearby, watching her own life, for the first time in over a decade, become entirely legible to her. Let this image rest alongside the others we have gathered tonight. A house does not need to be haunted to hold this kind of weight. It only needs to have been, for a time, the site of someone's slow and careful reckoning with the truth. The marble is gone now, replaced by ordinary asphalt and ordinary lives, but for one afternoon, in that space, something quietly and permanently changed. Every great Gilded Age house set aside its most protected rooms for its youngest occupants, and of all the concealments we will walk through tonight, this one is perhaps the gentlest to look at directly, and also, in its quiet way, one of the most consequential. The nursery wing of a grand mansion was typically tucked into a far corner of an upper floor, deliberately distant from the formal rooms where guests were entertained, distant even from the parents' own bedrooms in many cases. Governesses and nurses lived nearly full time within these small suites, and children of wealthy families might see their own mothers for a formal hour in the late afternoon, dressed and presented for inspection, before being returned to a world of nursery staff who managed almost every other hour of their waking lives. This arrangement is easy to view from the distance of over a century as simply the custom of its era, and in most households that is exactly what it was, unremarkable, ordinary, replicated in nursery after nursery across every fashionable address in every major city. But in the story of the Parisian palace we just left, the nursery wing carried a heavier weight than custom alone can explain, because in French law of that period, the question of who controlled a child's daily life was inseparable from the much larger question of who would win custody in the event of a marriage's collapse. The Count understood this leverage clearly, and for years it kept his wife bound to a marriage that had already, by any honest accounting, ceased to serve her interests. To leave meant risking a custody battle fought entirely on his home terrain, in his language, before judges shaped by the same aristocratic sympathies that had shielded him at every other turn. The nursery, in this specific and painful sense, functioned as a kind of hidden room of its own, not concealed behind panelling, but concealed behind law, a space whose true significance she could not act against until she had gathered enough resolve and enough secrecy of her own to remove her children from it entirely and simultaneously. When she finally did leave, emptying the palace in that single carefully planned afternoon, the children left with her. It was, in the context of everything we have just discussed, perhaps the single most important detail of the entire episode, more significant even than the furniture or the marble or the eventual financial settlement. She had understood correctly that leaving without them was not truly leaving at all, and had built her plan accordingly, in complete secrecy, over what appears to have been a considerable stretch of time. Let us widen the frame for a moment, beyond this single family, because the pattern of children functioning as leverage within a troubled Gilded Age marriage was not unique to one Parisian palace. Across the era's transatlantic marriages in particular, where American heiresses married into European titles, custody law consistently favoured the father and consistently favoured the country of his citizenship over hers. A number of these marriages, strained by the same financial patterns we have traced tonight, extraction on one side, ignorance on the other, produced years-long custody disputes that dragged on in foreign courts, long after the underlying marriage itself had effectively ended. This is difficult material for a story meant to help you rest, and we will not linger in the sharpest edges of it. But it belongs in tonight's accounting, because the architecture of concealment we have been tracing, hidden panels, locked drawers, safes without shared combinations, extended in its furthest reach into the custody of children themselves. A nursery door that could, in a very real legal sense, lock a mother out of her own child's future, however open that door stood in an ordinary physical sense on an ordinary afternoon. There is a gentler thread within this same subject, though, one worth holding on to as we move toward quieter chapters ahead. Many of the mothers in these grand houses, whatever the legal precariousness of their position, built extraordinarily close relationships with their children within the private confines of the nursery wing, relationships that existed almost entirely outside the performance required of them in the house's more public rooms. The nursery, whatever its legal vulnerabilities, was also frequently the one space in an enormous house where a mother could simply be present, unobserved by society, unburdened by the need to display anything at all. Surviving letters from several of the era's most documented households describe mothers slipping into the nursery in the early evening, after the formal hour of inspection had ended, and before the demands of a dinner party required their attention downstairs, simply to sit with a sleeping child for a few unrecorded minutes. No governess present, no staff observing, no performance required. It was, in its own small way, one more hidden room within the larger house, not concealed by architecture, but by the simple fact that no one considered it important enough to document, which meant, paradoxically, that it was one of the only truly private spaces available to her. We should be careful here not to romanticize a system that caused real and lasting harm to real women, and, at times, to their children as well. The legal architecture that made a mother's access to her own child conditional on her husband's goodwill was cruel, and it does not require softening to be understood as such. But within that cruelty, small pockets of genuine tenderness persisted, the way grass persists in the cracks of even the most deliberately sealed pavement, because human beings, placed inside almost any structure of constraint, will still find some small corner in which to simply be themselves for a moment. Picture, if you will, one such evening. A mother in a wide, quiet nursery, the gaslight turned low, a child already asleep in a crib carved with more ornamentation than the room strictly required. She has perhaps 20 minutes before she must return downstairs, before her hair must be repinned and her gown checked, and her expression arranged into the particular blend of warmth and composure her guests will expect of her. For those 20 minutes, she is simply a mother, sitting beside her child in the one room of an enormous house where nothing at all is being asked of her except her presence. This is worth returning to later tonight, when the larger financial dramas of the evening have quieted in your mind, and only the smaller, gentler images remain. Not every hidden room in this story held documents or debts or evidence of a husband's deception. Some of them held nothing more complicated than a woman sitting quietly beside a sleeping child, borrowing a few unrecorded minutes from a life that otherwise demanded almost constant performance. The nursery wings of these great houses are largely empty now, their cribs removed to museum storage or sold at estate auctions decades ago, their small rooms repurposed for whatever a historic house museum currently requires of them. But if you walk through one on a quiet afternoon, docent's voice fading into the background, you can still feel something of what those rooms once held. Not grandeur, not performance, just the ordinary private tenderness of a parent and a child, borrowed for 20 minutes from a world that rarely allowed either of them very much privacy at all. Let your own breathing settle into that same rhythm now, the unhurried rhythm of those 20 borrowed minutes. There is nothing more urgent waiting for you tonight than rest itself. Let us slow down here and look more closely at the trustee, that quiet, almost invisible figure who appears again and again in the financial architecture of these marriages, because he deserves more attention than the guidebooks ever give him. He is rarely named in the newspaper coverage of any given scandal. He rarely appears in the surviving photographs, and yet his decisions, made in offices these wives were never invited into, shaped the entire visible shape of their lives. A trustee, in the legal arrangement common to wealthy families of this era, was the man, and it was almost always a man, appointed to manage a woman's inheritance on her behalf, whether that inheritance came to her before marriage, or was settled on her by a father anxious to protect his daughter's fortune from a future husband's mismanagement. The intention behind the arrangement was not always malicious. In many cases it began as a genuine protective measure, a father's attempt to shield his daughter's money from exactly the kind of fortune hunter we met earlier tonight in his palace of pink marble. But the mechanism of protection carried within it a deeper cost, one that few fathers of the era seem to have weighed carefully enough. To protect a daughter's money from her husband, the trust structure had to first remove that money from her own direct control as well. She could not simply manage her own inheritance, because the entire premise of the arrangement assumed she needed protecting, from financial decisions generally, not merely from one particular husband's greed. The trustee who kept her fortune safe from a predatory marriage also, quite often, kept that same fortune at a careful distance from her own hands. Picture the correspondence that must have passed between a trustee's office and a wife's writing desk across the span of a typical year. a request for funds, phrased with the particular deference expected of a woman, addressing a man who controlled resources she legally owned but could not directly access. A response, sometimes prompt, sometimes delayed by weeks, granting or denying the request according to criteria she was rarely permitted to fully understand. An allowance disbursed quarterly, its size determined by considerations she could only guess at, since the underlying accounts, the actual performance of the investments that generated her income, remained entirely outside her view. Some trustees managed these responsibilities with genuine care, treating their charges' interests as a serious professional obligation rather than a formality. Others, and the historical record suggests rather more of them than polite society cared to acknowledge, treated the position as an opportunity, delaying disbursements, favouring investments that benefited their own business relationships, or simply failing, through negligence rather than malice, to monitor accounts closely enough to catch problems before they compounded into crises. The daughters and sisters who lived under these arrangements developed over time a particular kind of patience that does not translate easily into modern experience. It was not passivity exactly, though it could look like passivity from the outside. It was closer to a practiced diplomacy, a skill at phrasing financial requests in ways calculated to secure approval from men who held, quite literally, the power to say no to almost anything a woman might need. Letters requesting funds for a specific charitable cause, for a daughter's wedding trousseau, for repairs to a summer property, survive in family archives across the era, each one a small masterclass in the art of asking permission gracefully for something that was, in the most literal legal sense, already hers. There is a particular kind of hidden room in this chapter, though it takes a different shape than the panelled walls and false-bottom drawers we have discussed so far. This room exists in the gap between what a woman legally owned and what she was practically permitted to control. A gap that no architect ever built and no locksmith could ever open, because it was constructed entirely out of custom, expectation, and law working together in quiet cooperation. Women who grew frustrated enough with this arrangement had few formal avenues of recourse. A trustee could, in most jurisdictions, only be removed through a court proceeding that required demonstrating clear mismanagement, a high bar that favoured the trustee's discretion over the beneficiary's frustration in almost every ambiguous case. Some women simply endured the arrangement for their entire lives, never once gaining full control over money that legal documents identified, unambiguously, as their own. Others found workarounds quieter and less confrontational than a formal legal challenge, but no less determined in their effect. A wife might cultivate a warm personal relationship with her trustee, using charm and patience to secure more favourable treatment than a colder, more transactional relationship might have produced. Another might quietly build a second, smaller pool of resources entirely outside the trust's oversight, small gifts from friends or relatives, modest earnings from needlework or writing sold under a pseudonym, money that never touched the trust's official ledgers and therefore never required the trustee's approval at all. This second category of quiet financial independence deserves particular attention, because it represents perhaps the purest expression of everything we have been circling tonight. A woman, denied full control over the fortune that legally bore her name, built instead a second, smaller fortune entirely her own, dollar by careful dollar, hidden not behind a wall but behind the simple fact that no one thought to ask where it came from, because no one imagined she was capable of generating it in the first place. We know of several such arrangements from surviving letters and diaries, fragments preserved more by accident than by any deliberate effort at documentation. A woman in Philadelphia who sold embroidered linens through a small shop under an assumed name for over a decade, the profits kept in a separate account her husband never fully understood the purpose of. A woman in Boston who quietly lent money, at modest interest, to several younger relatives starting businesses of their own, building a small private banking practice entirely outside her family's official financial structure. Neither woman's activity would have registered, at the time, as remarkable. Both represent, in retrospect, a quiet and determined refusal to accept the boundaries the trust structure had drawn around them. It is worth remembering, as we sit with these stories, that none of this behaviour was considered scandalous by the standards of the era, provided it remained discreet. Society did not object, generally, to a woman managing a small private income, so long as that income never grew large enough or visible enough to challenge the larger financial architecture her husband or trustee maintained. The boundaries were flexible in practice, even where they were rigid in law, and many resourceful women learned to work within that flexibility without ever directly confronting the structure itself. The trustees, for their part, rarely appear in any of these stories as villains in the dramatic sense. Most were simply men doing what the era's customs and their own professional training told them was appropriate, managing a fortune according to standards that assumed, without much active malice, that the woman on the other end of the correspondence required guidance rather than authority. It was a system built on 1,000 small, ordinary assumptions rather than any single deliberate act of cruelty, which is in some ways precisely what made it so difficult to dismantle. As you rest here tonight, let this particular hidden room settle into something quieter than outrage. There is no dramatic reveal waiting at the end of this chapter, no locksmith, no emptied palace, only the slow, patient accumulation of small acts, women writing careful letters, building modest second incomes, cultivating relationships with the men who controlled their money, all of it adding up across years and sometimes across entire lifetimes to something that functioned, however imperfectly, as a form of quiet self-determination. The writing desks where these letters were composed are mostly empty now, their drawers holding nothing but dust and the faint impression of decades of careful handwriting pressed into the wood beneath the ink. But somewhere in the fibres of that wood, if you let your imagination rest there a moment, the patience of those letters still lingers, unhurried, deliberate, and entirely undefeated. Return with me now to the smaller, more intimate scale of a single piece of furniture, because after everything we have traced through trust documents and courtrooms and emptied palaces, it is worth remembering that most of the concealment in this story happened at a scale you could hold in two hands. A drawer, a box, a panel no larger than a book set into the side of a writing desk, invisible unless you already knew precisely where to press. Furniture makers of the Gilded Age understood this demand extremely well, and built for it accordingly, though almost none of them advertised the feature directly. A jewellery box might be constructed with a false bottom, its true depth concealed by careful proportion, so that even a husband familiar with the box's exterior dimensions would have no particular reason to suspect it held anything beyond the necklaces and brooches visible at first glance. A writing desk might include a drawer that appeared, on close measurement, slightly shallower than its casing suggested, the missing inches accounted for by a slim hidden compartment, reachable only by sliding a specific panel aside in a specific sequence. These were not exotic commissions available only to the extraordinarily wealthy. Catalogues from furniture makers across the era included such pieces as standard offerings, priced only modestly above their ordinary counterparts, purchased by women across a fairly wide range of income levels who understood, each in her own way, that a life lived under close observation sometimes required a place observation could not reach. What did these hidden compartments typically hold? We touched on this earlier, but it deserves a fuller accounting now because the contents tell us as much about these women's inner lives as any diary entry could. Letters appear again and again in the surviving record, correspondence from before a marriage, often from a suitor a family had rejected in favour of a more advantageous match, kept not necessarily out of ongoing romantic attachment, but simply because a woman was not always willing to destroy evidence of a version of her own life that once seemed possible. Correspondence from estranged family members appears just as often. Letters from a sister who had married beneath the family's expectations, or a brother whose political views embarrassed a husband's business associates, relationships a woman was expected to quietly minimize in public, but was not always willing to sever entirely in private. The hidden drawer became, in these cases, a small preserved space for relationships the household's official social calendar had no room for. Financial documents appear too, as we discussed, private ledgers and small caches of cash, evidence of an independent accounting a woman kept alongside, and sometimes instead of whatever figures her husband or trustee presented to her. And occasionally, in the rarer and more consequential cases, legal documents survive in these hidden spaces, a will drafted independently of a husband's knowledge, or in at least one well-documented instance, evidence of a small property purchased quietly under an assumed name, a modest cottage or a parcel of land that existed entirely outside the family's official holdings, a private foothold in the world that belonged to no one but the woman who had arranged for it. There is something worth pausing on here in the specific texture of these objects. A false-bottomed jewellery box is a small, almost domestic kind of engineering, built by a craftsman who understood exactly what he was making and why, without ever needing to ask the customer standing before him what, precisely, she intended to keep inside it. The craftsman's discretion was, in its own quiet way, part of the concealment itself, a professional agreement not to inquire too closely into a client's reasons, extended across an entire trade for decades. Consider the transaction from the craftsman's side for a moment. A well-dressed woman enters a furniture shop, perhaps accompanied by a maid, and requests in careful, indirect language a writing desk with certain particular features, a drawer of slightly unusual proportions, a panel that slides rather than pulls. The craftsman understands immediately what is being asked, has likely built dozens of similar pieces for other clients over the years, and asks no further questions. The commission is completed, delivered and installed in a bedroom where it will sit, unremarked upon, for decades, doing exactly the quiet work it was built to do. This entire quiet economy of concealment operated almost invisibly within the larger, more visible economy of Gilded Age commerce, a small but steady trade in objects built specifically to hold secrets, purchased by women who rarely if ever discussed the purpose of their purchase with anyone beyond the craftsman who built it. It left almost no trace in the historical record precisely because it was designed not to. We know it existed largely through the objects themselves, which occasionally surface at estate sales or in museum collections today, their false bottoms discovered decades after their original owners have died, their original contents long since removed, lost, or simply decayed beyond recognition. Imagine for a moment the particular loneliness and the particular comfort bound up together in an object like this. Loneliness, because its very existence testifies to a life in which privacy could not be assumed, in which even a woman's own bedroom offered no guaranteed protection from a husband's curiosity, a servant's gossip, or a trustee's scrutiny. Comfort, because within that constrained world, she had found, or commissioned, or simply claimed, one small space that answered to no one's authority but her own. Some of these hidden compartments were never discovered by anyone but their original owner. She used the space for years, decades even, filling it and emptying it and refilling it, according to whatever rhythm her private life required, and when she died, whatever remained inside simply passed, unnoticed, into an estate sale, purchased by a stranger who had no idea what small archive of a stranger's inner life they were carrying out the door, along with an ordinary-looking writing desk. Others were discovered, sometimes by accident, sometimes deliberately, by a husband or a child or an executor settling an estate, and in those cases, the discovery occasionally reshaped the family's understanding of a woman they had believed they knew completely. A packet of letters revealing a courtship no one in the family had ever mentioned. A small collection of savings no one had suspected existed. A deed to a property whose existence rewrote, in some small but permanent way, the family's sense of who this woman had actually been, beneath the version of her life that had always been visible. There is no way from this distance to know how many such drawers still exist, unopened, in attics and storage units and the back corners of antique shops across the country, holding whatever small private archive their original owner tucked away and never had reason or opportunity to retrieve. The house you're walking through tonight almost certainly contains at least one, somewhere in its 100 rooms, a compartment no docent has ever mentioned on any tour because no docent has ever found it. Let that possibility rest alongside you now, gently, the way all unopened questions eventually should. Somewhere in the walls around you, or perhaps simply somewhere in the larger idea of this era we have been walking through tonight, a small locked space still holds whatever it was asked to hold, patient, undisturbed, keeping its particular silence exactly as it was built to do. There is a kind of concealment in this story we have not yet spoken of directly, though it touched nearly every household we have visited tonight in one form or another. Grief, in the Gilded Age, followed its own elaborate architecture, as codified and as constraining in its way as any trust document, and it required its own hidden rooms, some literal, some closer to a private discipline of the heart. Mourning in this era operated according to a strict and widely understood set of stages, particularly for widows, who were expected to wear black crape for a year or more following a husband's death, to withdraw from society entirely for an initial period of deep mourning, and to return only gradually, through carefully calibrated stages of half-mourning and lighter dress, to the ordinary business of social life. The rules were less rigid for the loss of a child, but the expectation of visible, sustained grief remained largely the same, softened only slightly by circumstance. What these rules rarely accounted for was the private experience underneath the visible performance, the difference between grief as it was displayed and grief as it was actually felt, hour by hour, in rooms no guest ever entered. A woman might receive condolence calls in her formal black, composed and gracious, for exactly the socially appropriate duration, and then retreat afterward to a small sitting room or bedroom, set aside specifically for the parts of mourning that were never meant to be witnessed. Several of the grandest houses of this era included, somewhere within their floor plans, a room set aside informally for exactly this purpose, sometimes labelled on surviving architectural drawings simply as a lady's sitting room or a morning room, but understood within the family to serve, particularly in the aftermath of a death, as a space for grief that had not yet learned to compose itself for company. These rooms were rarely grand. Unlike the ballrooms and galleries built to impress, they were often modest, tucked into a quiet corner, furnished more for comfort than for display. In the Newport cottage we discussed earlier, and in several comparable houses along the same stretch of coastline, small rooms of exactly this character survive today, their original purpose sometimes noted on tours, more often simply passed by as one more unremarkable stop on a long circuit through grander spaces. But if you stand in one of these rooms long enough, letting the guide's voice fade into the background, something of their original function becomes almost tangible. A window positioned to catch afternoon light rather than morning light, better suited to quiet reflection than to entertaining. A chair placed slightly apart from the room's other furniture, angled toward the window rather than toward any door where a visitor might enter. We know from surviving letters that women of this era frequently wrote to one another about grief with a candour rarely extended to their husbands, or even, in some cases, to their own children. A widow writing to a sister or a close friend might describe, in detail her public mourning never allowed, the specific texture of a loss that continued reshaping her daily life, long after society considered the appropriate period of visible grief to have concluded. These letters, where they survive, offer some of the most emotionally direct writing to come out of an era otherwise defined by careful public composure. One such correspondence, preserved in a family archive and occasionally cited by historians studying the period's private emotional life, describes a widow's ongoing habit, years after her husband's death, and long after she had formally returned to society in full colour rather than mourning black, of retreating each evening to a small room adjoining her bedroom to sit, alone, for exactly the span of time it took a particular candle to burn down to its holder. No ritual explanation accompanies the description in her letters. It simply appears, mentioned almost in passing, as an ordinary part of her private routine, continued faithfully for years after any outward expectation of mourning had lapsed. This detail is worth sitting with, because it captures something essential about the difference between the visible architecture of Gilded Age grief and its actual lived experience. Society prescribed a year of black crepe, a defined sequence of half-mourning greys and lavenders, a calendar according to which grief was expected to visibly, measurably fade. The candle burning down each evening in its small quiet room followed no such calendar. It simply continued privately, for as long as it needed to, unwitnessed by anyone the household's social obligations required her to answer to. The loss of a child carried its own particular weight within this architecture, and its own particular silences. Infant and childhood mortality remained tragically common across every social class of this era, wealth offering meaningful protection against certain risks but no protection at all against many others. A family that had lost a child, and most large families of this period had lost at least one, developed its own private customs around how and whether that loss was discussed within the household's daily life. In some families, a lost child's room was maintained for years exactly as it had been, toys arranged, small clothes still folded in drawers, a kind of preserved space that functioned less as an active shrine, and more as a room the family simply could not bring itself to repurpose. In others, the opposite pattern prevailed, a deliberate and rapid clearing of any physical trace, the room reassigned to a new purpose within weeks, the child's name rarely spoken aloud in general company, grief pressed as far beneath the household's visible surface as it could be pressed. Neither pattern was necessarily healthier than the other, and it would be a mistake from this distance to judge either choice too harshly. Each represented a family's best available strategy for continuing to function within a social world that offered very little formal space for sustained, visible grief beyond its own narrow, prescribed calendar. The hidden room, in this context, was sometimes a literal preserved nursery, and sometimes something closer to an internal room, a private compartment of the heart that a mother learned to carry with her into ordinary rooms, opening it only when she was entirely alone. There is a particular kind of loneliness bound up in this pattern that deserves acknowledgement before we move forward tonight. A woman grieving within this architecture of prescribed mourning periods and careful public composure could not always turn to her own husband for the kind of raw, unstructured comfort that grief often requires, because he too was operating within his own set of expectations about how a man of his position should carry loss, expectations that generally discouraged visible emotional display even more strictly than the rules governing women's mourning did. This left many of these marriages, already strained by the financial concealments and legal asymmetries we have traced throughout tonight's story, carrying an additional layer of unspoken grief that neither partner felt fully able to share with the other, each retreating instead into whatever private room, literal or otherwise, allowed them to grieve without an audience. It is one more quiet tragedy folded into an era already so thoroughly defined by concealment that even loss, perhaps the most universal of all human experiences, so often had to be carried alone, behind a closed door, in a house built to hold 400 guests but rarely designed with any single room set aside for genuine, unwitnessed comfort. And yet, within this same constrained architecture, small mercies persisted. A close friend who understood, without being told, that a particular afternoon call should be shorter than usual, gentler in its conversation. A lady's maid who learned, over years of service, exactly which small comforts, a particular blanket, a specific arrangement of the curtains, might ease a difficult evening, and provided them quietly, without comment, as simply part of her ordinary duties. A sister writing from another city, whose letters arrived with enough regularity and enough genuine warmth that they became, themselves, a kind of hidden room, a private correspondence carrying comfort no formal social structure was equipped to offer. As you rest here tonight, let this chapter settle more gently than some of the others we have walked through. There is grief in this story, real and significant, but there is also, folded quietly alongside it, the patient, resourceful tenderness of women finding whatever small private spaces they could within an era that offered them so few in which to simply feel what they needed to feel for exactly as long as they needed to feel it. Every grand house of this era kept, somewhere within its private quarters, a small cabinet or cupboard set aside for medicines, and of all the rooms and spaces we have discussed tonight, this one may hold the most complicated history because it sat at the intersection of genuine physical suffering, an era's limited medical understanding, and the same broader architecture of concealment that shaped nearly everything else in a Gilded Age wife's private life. Medicine in this period operated under a very different set of assumptions than our own. Many common remedies of the time contained ingredients that would raise serious concern today, prescribed by physicians who genuinely believed, according to the medical knowledge available to them, that they were offering relief rather than risk. Women in particular were frequently prescribed such remedies for a wide range of conditions loosely gathered under the era's vague and often dismissive medical language around female nervous complaints, complaints that we would today recognize in many cases as postpartum depression, chronic pain, anxiety, or simply the ordinary and understandable exhaustion of a life lived under constant social and financial constraint. We should be careful and gentle in how we hold this part of the story tonight, because it touches on real suffering, real medical limitations, and real human vulnerability, without romanticizing or dwelling on specifics that belong more properly to a medical history than to the kind of unhurried atmospheric account we're building this evening. What matters for our purposes is simply this: the medicine cabinet, like the writing desk and the jewellery box before it, became for many women another small private space, its contents known fully only to the woman herself, and, at times, to a trusted physician or lady's maid, and rarely discussed openly within the household's more public conversations. A husband might know in general terms that his wife suffered from nerves, or from headaches, or from a delicacy of constitution, language broad enough to cover an enormous range of actual experience without requiring any more specific accounting. The precise nature of what she took, how often and why, remained in many households entirely her own private matter, managed quietly between herself and whichever physician she consulted, often without her husband's direct involvement at all. This privacy cut in more than one direction, and it is worth sitting with both of them honestly. On one hand, it offered a rare pocket of genuine autonomy within a life otherwise defined by financial and legal dependence, a space in which a woman's physical experience belonged, at least nominally, to herself and her physician, rather than to her husband's oversight. On the other hand, that same privacy, combined with the limited medical understanding of the period and the era's tendency to medicate rather than meaningfully address the underlying sources of a woman's distress, sometimes left individual women more isolated in their suffering than a more open, less concealed approach might have allowed. Several surviving diaries from the period describe this tension with a candour that feels, even from this distance, remarkably contemporary. A woman writing privately, in pages she clearly never intended for wider circulation, might describe both genuine relief from a particular remedy and a growing private worry about her increasing reliance on it, worries she felt she could share with no one in her immediate household, not her husband, whose concern she feared would translate into an embarrassing and unwelcome level of scrutiny, and not always even her physician, whose professional confidence in the remedy she did not always feel able to question. This particular hidden room, then, is less a physical space than a private negotiation, carried out largely in silence, between a woman's actual physical and emotional experience and the narrow, often inadequate vocabulary her era offered her for describing it. The cabinet itself was usually unremarkable, a simple case of small bottles and folded papers of powder, kept perhaps in a dressing room or beside a bed, its contents rearranged and replenished according to a private rhythm that rarely intersected with the household's more visible calendar of social obligations. It is worth noting gently that this same private space also held, for many women, the actual meaningful comfort that friendship and correspondence with other women could not always fully provide. Real physical pain, chronic and poorly understood by the medicine of the day, was a genuine and constant presence in many of these lives. The aftermath of difficult childbirths, attended by physicians working without many of the basic protections and understandings modern medicine now takes for granted, the ordinary wear of a body that had in many cases borne several children in close succession, with little formal recovery time between them. We should hold this alongside everything else we have discussed tonight without letting it become the dominant note of the evening, because that would misrepresent both the specific texture of these women's lives and the gentler purpose of the story we're telling. Suffering existed genuinely and significantly within these grand houses, exactly as it exists within any life fully lived across any era. But so did resilience, and so did the quiet, resourceful work of finding whatever comfort and whatever privacy an inadequate system allowed. Some women, drawing on financial independence carefully built through the small private accounts and hidden savings we discussed earlier in the evening, sought out physicians beyond their household's usual circle, doctors recommended quietly by trusted friends rather than selected by a husband's business associates, seeking a second opinion or a different course of treatment without necessarily informing the rest of the household of the change. This too was a form of the same quiet self-determination we have traced through nearly every chapter tonight. Small, careful, largely invisible acts of a woman managing her own life, as fully as the constraints around her allowed. The medicine cabinets of these grand houses are almost entirely empty today, their original contents long since discarded by later owners or museum conservators, wary of preserving substances no longer considered safe. What remains, in most cases, is simply the cabinet itself, a small unremarkable case of drawers or shelves tucked into a corner of a dressing room that most museum visitors walk past without a second glance, the guide's attention usually reserved for grander, more photogenic rooms nearby. But if you pause there a moment, on your imagined walk through this house tonight, let yourself hold the weight of what that small cabinet once represented. Not scandal, not simple weakness, as the era's own dismissive language sometimes implied, something closer to the ordinary unglamorous work of a person managing real physical and emotional difficulty within a system that offered her very few good tools for doing so, and finding within that inadequate system whatever small measure of relief and privacy she could. Let this settle now, quietly, the way we have let each chapter settle before moving forward. There is nothing more to examine here tonight beyond simple acknowledgement, the recognition that behind every grand and photographed room in these houses there existed also this smaller, more private geography of ordinary human vulnerability, tended to as best as an imperfect era knew how. No one in a great Gilded Age house knew more about the family's true private life than the servants did, and almost no one's knowledge was more thoroughly disregarded by the historical record. We have spent much of tonight discussing the hidden rooms wives claimed for themselves, but there is a population within these houses whose entire working existence was itself a kind of hidden room, present everywhere, seen almost nowhere and privy, in the ordinary course of daily duties, to nearly every secret the family above them believed they were keeping. A lady's maid dressed her mistress every morning and undressed her every evening, present for exactly the private moments, tears held back through a formal dinner, and finally released once the drawing-room's doors had closed, or a difficult letter read and reread late at night that the household's public performance was designed to conceal from everyone else. A butler managed the household's correspondence in ways that occasionally required him to notice postmarks, return addresses, and the frequency of letters from particular correspondents, noticing patterns a family member absorbed in their own life might miss entirely. The back staircases we discussed earlier in the evening, narrow and built for invisibility, carried not only linens and coal but also, inevitably, information. A housemaid moving between floors overheard conversations not meant for her ears. A footman waiting in a hallway noticed which rooms a family member entered late at night and which they avoided. None of this was necessarily gathered with any malicious intent. It was simply the unavoidable byproduct of proximity, the same way anyone who works closely alongside another person, in any era, eventually comes to know more about that person's private patterns than either party might consciously intend. The households of this era developed elaborate, largely unwritten codes of discretion to manage this reality, codes servants were expected to absorb quickly and observe without exception. What was seen below stairs stayed below stairs, at least in theory, and a servant who violated this expectation, who gossiped too freely about a family's private business, risked immediate dismissal, and, more damagingly, the loss of the kind of reference letter that made future employment possible at all. The threat was significant enough that most servants learned discretion as a matter of professional survival rather than personal loyalty alone. And yet, discretion toward outsiders did not always mean silence within the household staff itself. Below the family's notice entirely, an active, sophisticated information economy operated among the servants, housekeepers comparing notes with ladies' maids, coachmen sharing observations with footmen, all of it flowing through a network largely invisible to the family whose lives it concerned. This servant's knowledge occasionally became, in its own quiet way, a form of protection for the family members who most needed it. There are documented instances, preserved in memoirs written by former servants later in life, of a lady's maid quietly alerting her mistress to a husband's financial difficulties, well before the family's formal advisors or lawyers had assembled the courage or the occasion to do so. Information gathered simply through years of noticing which tradesmen's bills went unpaid a little longer than usual, which letters from creditors arrived with increasing frequency, which household economies were quietly imposed without any public explanation. A mistress attentive to her own staff's observations sometimes gained a clearer, earlier picture of her family's true financial position than any formal accounting ever offered her. This is worth pausing on because it complicates the picture we have been building tonight in a useful way. The architecture of concealment we have traced, hidden panels, locked safes, trustees managing information a wife was never shown, was not absolute. It had gaps, and the people most likely to notice and occasionally exploit those gaps, in the gentlest sense of that word, were often the servants who moved through the house's every corner with a familiarity no family member, however curious, could match. Some of these relationships between mistress and maid grew into genuine, if carefully bounded, alliances. A maid who had served a family for decades, who had dressed a young bride on her wedding day and continued serving her through every subsequent stage of the marriage, developed a kind of intimate knowledge and, in many documented cases, a kind of loyalty that exceeded the household's formal employment relationship. Several surviving accounts describe maids who helped their mistresses conceal small private savings from a husband's scrutiny, who carried discreet correspondence to a lawyer or a sympathetic relative, who simply provided, through years of quiet loyalty, exactly the kind of trusted confidence a woman isolated within her own marriage badly needed. It would be a mistake to romanticize this relationship too fully, because it existed within a profoundly unequal structure of its own, a servant's economic survival depending entirely on her employer's goodwill, her own private life subject to constraints and scrutiny that mirrored, in some ways, the constraints her mistress lived under, though compounded by a difference in class and very often in resources that left the servant with far less room to maneuver. A lady's maid's loyalty, however genuine, existed within a relationship she could not easily walk away from without risking her own livelihood. But within that unequal structure, real human connection persisted, the way it tends to persist in any relationship sustained over years of close daily contact. We know of ladies' maids who remained with the same family for their entire working lives, who were remembered generously in their mistress's will, who attended family funerals not as staff but as genuine mourners, their grief indistinguishable, in the accounts of those present, from the grief of blood relatives. These relationships do not erase the deep structural inequality of the era's domestic service arrangements, but they do complicate any picture of the Gilded Age household that treats its staff as simply invisible machinery. The backstairs, then, carried more than linens and coal and gossip. They carried, in a handful of documented and surely countless undocumented instances, a form of quiet solidarity between women placed in very different positions within the same household but united in certain private moments by a shared understanding of what it meant to live one's life, largely at the discretion of powerful men neither of them had much practical ability to challenge directly. Consider, as you rest here, the particular geometry of that solidarity. A mistress descending the grand staircase each evening in her finest gown, greeted by name in every society column in the city. A maid climbing the narrow backstairs behind her, unnamed in any public record, her own private life almost entirely unrecorded by history. And yet, in the quiet hour before a dinner party, in the careful buttoning of a gown, in the exchange of a glance that required no words, something passed between them that the grand staircase downstairs, for all its marble and gilt, was never built to hold. The servants' quarters of these great houses, when they survive at all, are rarely restored with the same care given to the family's public rooms. Plain walls, simple furniture, small windows, sometimes tucked, as we discussed earlier, entirely out of the exterior sightline of the house. But it is worth remembering, as you let this chapter settle, that within these plain rooms lived an entire population whose quiet knowledge of the family above them was often more complete, and in certain important moments more genuinely useful than any of the family's own official advisers ever managed to be. Let this thought rest alongside the others tonight, gently, the way the house itself seems to be settling around you now, its old timbers easing into the deepening night, its many rooms, grand and plain alike, finally growing quiet together. There is one marriage from this era so thoroughly documented, so extensively photographed and reported upon, that it offers us something the other stories tonight cannot quite provide, a chance to watch the entire machinery of Gilded Age marriage operate in full public view, every gear visible, every hidden room made temporarily, uncomfortably transparent. In the autumn of 1895, a young American heiress married a British duke in a ceremony so lavishly covered by the press that newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic devoted entire pages to descriptions of her gown, her jewels, her carriage, and the guest list assembled to witness the union of American railroad money with one of England's oldest titles. She was 18 years old. She had been in love, by her own later account, with someone else entirely, a young man her mother considered financially and socially unsuitable. Her mother, one of the most formidable social engineers of the entire Gilded Age, a woman we have already met tonight in connection with a marble palace on Bellevue Avenue, had spent years constructing the conditions for exactly this marriage. She understood, with the same clear-eyed strategic instinct that had once forced the reigning queen of New York society to acknowledge her own family's arrival at the top of the social order, that a British dukedom, chronically short of the funds necessary to maintain its ancestral estates, represented the single most valuable prize an American railroad fortune could purchase. Her daughter's own preferences factored into this calculation only marginally, if at all. The daughter would later describe in a memoir written decades afterward, once she was finally free to speak candidly about her own experience, a wedding day conducted through what she remembered as a haze of tears, hidden as best she could manage behind a heavy veil. A bride performing radiant happiness for a church full of guests and a worldwide newspaper readership, while privately understanding that she had been manoeuvred, systematically and with very little regard for her own wishes, into a marriage designed primarily to serve her mother's social ambitions and her new husband's family's urgent financial needs. The numbers involved were by any measure extraordinary. Her dowry included a substantial cash settlement along with an annual income guaranteed for the duration of the marriage, funds that flowed directly toward the restoration of a vast ancestral English estate, whose roof quite literally had been leaking for want of exactly this kind of infusion. The Duke received his fortune. Her family received a title that instantly elevated their social standing beyond anything money alone, however vast, could have purchased on American soil. What the arrangement did not include, and what neither party seems to have expected it to include, was any particular obligation toward affection or compatibility. The marriage was, from its earliest days, a business arrangement conducted between two people who happened to share a household, a dynamic the young bride would later describe with a directness that still carries real weight more than a century later. She understood, quite clearly and quite early, that she'd been acquired rather than courted, that her own feelings had factored into the negotiation, only insofar as her mother judged them an obstacle to be managed rather than a consideration to be honoured. The estate she moved into upon her marriage was, and remains, one of the grandest private residences in England, its grounds landscaped generations earlier by one of the era's most celebrated designers, its staterooms hung with paintings and tapestries accumulated across centuries of ducal inheritance. And within this vast and celebrated house, the new Duchess found herself navigating a version of the same architecture of concealment we have traced across every American mansion tonight, except now compounded by an entirely foreign social system, an unfamiliar set of aristocratic customs, and a household staff whose loyalty, cultivated over generations of service to the same family, did not automatically extend to a new American bride, however wealthy her family remained. She learned, over the years that followed, to build her own version of the quiet private spaces we have discussed throughout tonight's story. She became deeply involved in charitable work within the estate's surrounding community, work that gave her a genuine sense of purpose and, importantly, a sphere of activity that existed largely outside her husband's direct oversight. She corresponded extensively with friends and family in America, letters that preserved, across the distance of an ocean, relationships her marriage had geographically but not emotionally severed. The marriage itself did not survive in the end, though it took over a decade to formally dissolve, complicated by the same tangle of social expectation, financial entanglement, and religious constraint that made divorce difficult for women of every social class in this era, regardless of how much wealth stood behind them. When the separation finally came, it arrived with considerably less scandal than the earlier divorce we discussed tonight, perhaps because society's tolerance for such arrangements had shifted somewhat in the intervening years, or perhaps simply because the marriage's unhappiness had been an open secret for so long that its ending surprised almost no one who had followed the story. What makes this particular marriage so useful to our purposes tonight is not its uniqueness, but precisely the opposite, its representativeness. Historians who have studied the pattern of these transatlantic marriages, American fortune paired with European title, count several hundred such unions across the final decades of the 19th century and the opening years of the 20th, each one negotiated according to broadly similar terms, each one binding together, at least on paper, an American family's money and a European family's rank, with the actual feelings and preferences of the young woman at the centre of the transaction weighed, in case after documented case, as a secondary consideration at best. There is a particular kind of hidden room contained within this pattern, though it takes yet another different shape than the ones we have examined so far tonight. This room exists in the gap between a wedding day's public performance and its private reality, between the radiant bride photographed for newspapers around the world and the 18-year-old girl crying behind a veil heavy enough to hide it. The concealment here was not architectural. It did not require a false panel or a locked drawer. It required only a veil, thick enough and long enough to hold a private grief invisible to several hundred wedding guests and an entire newspaper readership for exactly as long as the ceremony required. We should be careful, even here, not to flatten this story into pure victimhood, because the woman at its centre went on to live a life of considerable independence and genuine accomplishment, particularly in the decades following her eventual divorce and remarriage. She became a significant supporter of causes ranging from public health to women's suffrage, using both her fortune and her social position, considerable in their own right regardless of the marriage that had initially secured them, to advance work she found genuinely meaningful. The 18-year-old bride behind the veil was not in the end the final version of who she became. But the wedding day itself remains, in the historical record, a kind of case study in exactly the machinery we have been examining tonight, the way an entire social and financial system could arrange itself around the transfer of a young woman's fortune, and by extension her future, with her own preferences treated as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a factor to be weighed. It happened in full public view, photographed and reported in exhaustive detail, and still, somehow, it required a veil thick enough to hide what was actually happening underneath the spectacle. Consider, as this chapter settles, how many of the era's most visible weddings likely concealed some version of the same private reality, a bride's genuine feelings folded away behind whatever the day's chosen fashion happened to offer in the way of concealment, lace or veiling, or simply the practiced composure every young woman of this class was trained, from an early age, to maintain regardless of what she actually felt underneath it. The gowns survive today in museum collections, beautifully preserved, endlessly photographed by visitors who rarely pause to wonder what the woman wearing it, on the one day of her life it was made for, might actually have been feeling as she walked down an aisle toward a future she had very little hand in choosing. To understand why so many of these women found themselves needing hidden rooms at all, we need to spend some time tonight with the machine that made concealment necessary in the first place, the social apparatus of the Gilded Age itself, which operated with a precision and a ruthlessness that few of its participants, even at the time, fully understood they were caught inside. At the centre of New York society in the final decades of the 19th century sat a woman whose ballroom, by design, held exactly 400 guests, a number chosen not arbitrarily, but according to the physical capacity of her own home, and which came, through the sheer force of her social authority, to define the outer boundary of who counted as socially significant in the entire city. If your name did not appear on her guest list, you did not, in the only sense that mattered to this particular world, exist. Her social secretary, a man whose entire professional occupation consisted of managing precisely this list, cultivated it with the strategic precision of a general staffing a campaign, weighing family lineage against wealth against reputation, adjusting the roster season by season as fortunes rose and occasionally, catastrophically, fell. To be included required more than money, though money was certainly necessary. It required a sustained, expensive, and exhausting performance of belonging repeated night after night, season after season, with no acceptable pause. The performance itself was staggering in its cost. A single woman of this circle might change her entire outfit several hundred times across the course of a single Newport summer season, each gown worn exactly once before being retired, many of them shipped across the Atlantic from Paris in trunks the size of small rooms. A single evening's entertainment could cost more than most American families earned across an entire decade. Flowers alone for one significant dinner might run to sums that would have covered a modest house. None of this spending was optional, in the practical sense that mattered to the women managing it. To repeat a gown was social death. To appear underdressed was social death. To fail to host, on a scale matching or exceeding one's peers, was social death of the most immediate and public kind. And social death in this world did not remain contained to the individual who committed the offence. It extended forward into the marriage prospects of daughters, the business relationships of sons, the entire future trajectory of a family standing across a generation or more. So the women of this world spent relentlessly and without apparent limit, because the machine that governed their social existence offered no acceptable alternative. And here is the detail worth sitting with carefully tonight, because it connects directly to everything else we have discussed this evening. The newspapers that covered this spending in exhaustive, breathless detail almost never reported on where the money actually came from, or whether it was, in any given case, money that genuinely existed rather than money borrowed against assets already pledged elsewhere. The social machine did not concern itself with solvency, it concerned itself entirely with appearance. A family that reduced its spending for whatever reason, internal or financial, was understood by the entire watching world not as prudent but as failing, and the invitations and the social position they represented dried up accordingly, regardless of whether the underlying reduction in spending reflected genuine financial distress, or simply, in rarer cases, a family's deliberate choice to live within more modest means. This created, across the entire upper tier of Gilded Age society, a powerful and largely invisible incentive toward exactly the kind of financial concealment we traced earlier tonight, through the story of the platinum doors and the safe that required a locksmith. Husbands borrowed, leveraged and mortgaged, not despite their wives' ignorance of the family's true financial position, but in a very real sense because of it. Because a wife who did not know the mounting debts could continue performing the confident, lavish hostess the social machine demanded. Undistracted by anxieties her husband had decided, whether out of protectiveness or simple pride, she did not need to carry. The system, in other words, made honesty considerably more expensive than concealment, and rewarded exactly the behaviour we have spent tonight examining from a dozen different angles. A husband who told his wife the truth about the family's precarious finances risked an immediate change in her outward behaviour, a scaling back of the spending the social machine required, and with it, the visible signal of failure the entire watching city was primed to notice and to punish. A husband who kept the truth concealed bought his family and himself another season of appearing exactly as prosperous as everyone assumed they were. Consider the particular cruelty embedded in this arrangement for the women living inside it. They were, in the most literal sense, the primary engines of a spending machine whose true financial mechanics they were, in case after documented case, deliberately kept from understanding. They hosted the dinners that consumed fortunes they did not know were already compromised. They wore the gowns that were, in more than one case we have discussed tonight, purchased with borrowed money against assets already pledged elsewhere. They performed night after night a confidence in their family's prosperity that was, unbeknownst to them, often already a fiction. And when the fiction eventually collapsed, as it did with devastating regularity across the fortunes of this era, it was very often the wife who bore the most visible public consequence, her name attached in the newspapers to the scandal of a husband's mismanagement, her own careful decades of social performance suddenly recast in the public imagination as either naivety or complicity, regardless of how thoroughly she had actually been kept from the truth. The panics of this era, the financial crises of the 1890s and again in the first decade of the new century, exposed this pattern with particular force, because they exposed, simultaneously and often within the same social season, dozens of fortunes that had appeared, right up until the moment of collapse, entirely secure. Banks failed, trust companies collapsed, railroad stocks, the favourite investment vehicle of an entire generation of wealthy men, lost half their value within a matter of weeks in some cases, and the wives who had spent the preceding years hosting dinners and commissioning gowns on the strength of fortunes that turned out to be substantially leveraged, discovered, often with very little warning, exactly how thin the margin between their visible prosperity and actual financial ruin had always been. It would be a mistake to view this system as the product of any single villain, any one particularly cruel husband or particularly ruthless social arbiter. It was, instead, a self-reinforcing structure that most of its participants, men and women alike, experienced less as a deliberate conspiracy and more as simply the unquestioned shape of the world they had been born into or married into, a set of rules so thoroughly internalized that few people at the time seemed to have paused to ask whether they might be constructed rather than natural, changeable rather than fixed. The reforms that eventually followed, the Married Women's Property Acts that expanded gradually across the following decades, the financial regulations imposed after the panics, exposed the fragility of the entire unregulated system, the slow cultural shift toward greater openness about family finances within a marriage arrived not because any individual confessed to any individual wrongdoing, but because the accumulated weight of so many broken fortunes, so many devastated wives, so many collapsed marriages, finally became too heavy for the old structure to bear without visible cracking. The 400-guest ballroom still stands today, preserved as a museum, its gold leaf polished, its chandeliers still catching whatever light the afternoon tours allow to fall through its tall windows. Visitors walk through it now admiring the craftsmanship, rarely pausing to consider the machinery of obligation and concealment that once filled it, with exactly 400 people, night after night, each one performing a confidence in their own prosperity that not all of them, as it eventually turned out, actually possessed. Let this larger picture settle now, alongside the smaller, more personal stories we have gathered throughout the evening. Every hidden drawer, every locked safe, every private ledger we have discussed tonight existed within this larger machine, a system built not by any single hand, but by an entire era's collective agreement about what appearance required and what truth could be allowed to cost. The women who built their own small private spaces of resistance within that system were not fighting any one villain. They were finding whatever small room they could within a structure far larger than any individual marriage, a structure that would take decades and the accumulated weight of countless private struggles like the ones we have traced tonight to finally begin to change. Not every woman in tonight's story built her private room out of concealment. Some built it instead out of open, deliberate refusal, and their stories deserve equal space in this account, because they show us a different kind of response to the same constrained world we have been walking through all evening. Consider the eldest daughter of one of the railroad fortunes we discussed earlier tonight, a woman who watched her brother inherit effective control of the family's business interests upon their father's death, and who spent the following decades observing, from a position of relative financial security but very limited actual authority, as that brother's ambitious and ultimately disastrous expansion project steadily consumed a fortune that had once seemed inexhaustible. She was, by most surviving accounts, unmarried by her own considered choice rather than circumstance, a decision that itself represented a quiet defiance of her era's expectations, since an unmarried woman of her wealth and position faced constant, persistent social pressure to enter into exactly the kind of arranged marriage we discussed a few chapters ago. She chose instead to remain independent, managing her own portion of the family fortune with a degree of personal authority that few of her married contemporaries were ever permitted. What she did with that authority tells us something important about the range of responses available to women within this constrained system. Rather than hoarding her resources, rather than building the kind of quiet private reserve we have discussed in several other chapters tonight, she gave enormous sums away, deliberately and publicly, to causes she considered genuinely important. She funded hospital wings, she built libraries, she supported returning soldiers with a generosity that transformed several charitable organizations from modest local efforts into significant national institutions. There is a reading of this behavior that frames it simply as philanthropy, the ordinary charitable activity expected of wealthy women across this entire era, and on its surface, that reading is not wrong. But sit with the timing and the context a little longer, and something more deliberate begins to emerge. She was giving away, systematically and at scale, exactly the kind of fortune her brother was simultaneously destroying through mismanagement, and she seems to have understood, with a clarity that several of her surviving letters suggest was quite conscious, that money kept within the family's control was money vulnerable to exactly the kind of collapse she watched unfold around her for decades. Better, she seemed to conclude, to place her resources somewhere they could do lasting good, in the hands of institutions and causes that would outlast any single family's financial mismanagement, than to watch her own portion eventually absorbed into the same pattern of leveraged ambition and eventual collapse that consumed so much of her family's larger fortune. It was, in its own way, a form of the same quiet self-determination we have traced all evening, expressed not through concealment but through decisive, irreversible action, moving her resources beyond the reach of any future crisis before that crisis could arrive. This represents a meaningfully different relationship to the whole architecture of concealment we have spent tonight examining. Where other women in our story built hidden drawers and private ledgers, carving out small protected spaces within a system they could not fully escape, This woman used her particular combination of independence, wealth, and personal conviction to step largely outside the system's more constraining expectations altogether, choosing her own causes, managing her own giving, and building a public legacy that had almost nothing to do with the social machine of gowns and ballrooms we discussed in the previous chapter. It would be inaccurate to suggest her path was universally available. She benefited from resources, an unmarried status that removed one significant layer of legal and financial dependency, and a particular combination of personal temperament and family circumstance that most women of her era simply did not share. Her story is not a template so much as a demonstration of range, evidence that even within a system built, in so many of the ways we have discussed tonight, to constrain women's financial and personal autonomy, some individuals found genuine, substantial space to act according to their own convictions. Her charitable foundations and the institutions she built or substantially supported largely survive today, transformed by more than a century of continued operation into something considerably different from what she originally established, but still, in most cases, tracing their institutional lineage directly back to her deliberate decisions about where her portion of a vast and troubled family fortune should ultimately go. It is, in its own quiet way, one of the more enduring hidden rooms in tonight's entire story. Not a physical space at all, but a body of ongoing work continuing to operate in the world long after the woman who founded it, and the fortune that funded it, might otherwise have simply dissolved into obscurity. There is something worth holding on to here as the evening continues to deepen around you. Not every response to a constrained system needs to look the same. Some women in tonight's story hid what they could and waited for circumstances to change around them. Others planned careful, patient escapes, executed with the precision of the emptied palace we discussed earlier tonight. And at least one built her response in the opposite direction entirely, giving away rather than holding on, choosing openness and public purpose over concealment and private reserve, and finding in that choice her own particular version of the same autonomy every woman in this story was, in her own way, quietly working toward. Picture her now, in the years after her brother's financial empire had largely collapsed around him, still managing her own independent resources with the same careful attention she had always brought to the work, still funding hospitals and libraries and soldiers' welfare with a steadiness that seemed, by every surviving account, entirely undisturbed by the chaos unfolding elsewhere in her family's affairs. There is a particular kind of peace in that image, worth carrying forward as we move toward the quieter final chapters of tonight's story. The institutions she built continue their work in cities across the country even now, largely unremarked upon by the millions of people who benefit from them, their founder's name attached to a plaque or a building cornerstone that most passers-by never pause to read closely. It is perhaps exactly the kind of quiet, lasting legacy she seems to have intended, less concerned with being remembered than with having genuinely, tangibly helped, decade after decade, long after her own name had faded from the newspaper columns that once tracked her family's every financial fluctuation with such breathless, ultimately misleading attention. We touched earlier tonight on the pattern of remarriage that followed so many of these Gilded Age financial collapses, but the pattern deserves a fuller, more patient look now, because it reveals something important about how quickly the same architecture of concealment could reassert itself, even for women who had already learned through considerable hardship exactly what to watch for. Consider the widow of the man who built the platinum-doored mansion, the observatory, the vast art collection that turned out to be pledged many times over against debts she never knew existed. Less than a month after burying a husband who left her almost nothing once the true accounting was complete, she married again, this time to a much younger man, an adventurer with a gift for conversation and a background that included failed gold prospecting in the Klondike and a loosely defined career managing prize-fighters in San Francisco's theatre district. It is tempting from this distance to view this second marriage simply as an error in judgment, a grieving and financially disoriented woman making an unwise choice in a vulnerable moment. And there is truth in that reading. But there is also something more structurally revealing here, worth sitting with carefully, because her situation illustrates just how few genuinely safe options the era actually offered a woman in her position, however much she may have learned from her first marriage's collapse. She was, at this point in her life, a woman in her late 40s, recently widowed, publicly associated with a scandal of financial ruin that had made headlines across the country, her social standing considerably diminished from its earlier heights, her actual remaining wealth far more modest than the newspapers' earlier reporting on her husband's supposed fortune had led the public to assume. In an era that offered very few respectable avenues for a woman in this position to build an independent life, remarriage remained, for many women, the path of least resistance, whatever risks it might carry. The second marriage, unsurprisingly given everything we have discussed tonight, followed a familiar pattern, though compressed into a much shorter time frame and conducted at a considerably smaller financial scale than her first. Her new husband, it became increasingly clear, had married her for whatever resources she had left rather than for any particular affection, and the marriage dissolved within a relatively short period, leaving her with even less than she had possessed before it began. This pattern, a woman moving from one financially exploitative marriage into another, sometimes within a matter of months, appears with troubling regularity across the surviving records of this era, particularly among widows whose first marriages had already left them in reduced or uncertain financial circumstances. The architecture of concealment we have traced all evening did not require an elaborate first marriage to operate. It could reconstruct itself quickly, opportunistically, wherever a vulnerable woman and an insufficient legal and social safety net happened to intersect. She would later tell a reporter, toward the end of her own life, that she felt like nothing more than one more shattered ornament among many, a phrase that captures, with a bluntness rare for her era's usual careful language around such matters, exactly how thoroughly this pattern of exploitation had worn down a woman who had once presided over one of the most photographed households in New York. Not a unique tragedy in her own accounting of it, simply one more woman, among a great many others, discarded once her usefulness to the system that had shaped her entire adult life came to an end. It would be easy to let this chapter conclude on that note of bleakness, and it would not be an inaccurate place to end it. But there is a different pattern worth setting alongside this one, because not every second marriage in tonight's story followed the same trajectory. Consider instead the young bride we discussed a few chapters ago, married against her own wishes to a British duke, her fortune funding a leaking ancestral roof, her own preferences treated throughout the negotiation as a secondary consideration at best. Her second marriage, arriving years after her difficult first divorce, followed a markedly different pattern. She chose her second husband herself, an aviation pioneer whose interests and temperament, by most surviving accounts, aligned considerably more closely with her own than her first husband's had, and the marriage that followed appears, across the documentary record available to us, to have been considerably happier and more genuinely collaborative than her first. She brought to this second choice everything the earlier marriage had taught her, about financial vigilance, about the importance of independent legal counsel, about the specific warning signs of a partner more interested in her resources than in her actual company. The difference between these two second marriages, one repeating an old pattern of exploitation at smaller scale, the other representing genuine growth and hard-won wisdom, tells us something important about the range of outcomes available even within a system that offered women so few structural protections. Neither woman controlled the fundamental architecture of the world she lived inside. Both remained subject to laws and customs that gave husbands considerably more financial and legal authority than wives, well into the 20th century in many jurisdictions. But within that shared constraint their individual paths diverged significantly, shaped by differences in resources, in temperament, in the specific lessons each woman drew from her own particular experience of the same underlying system. This is worth holding on to as tonight's story continues to gather itself toward its final chapters. The architecture of concealment we have traced all evening was real, and it caused genuine, lasting harm to genuine women whose full names and complete life stories deserve more space than any single documentary account, however patient, can ever fully provide. But it did not determine every outcome with equal cruelty. Some women, given even slightly more favourable circumstances, slightly more resources, or simply the hard-won wisdom of an earlier, more painful chapter in their own lives, found their way toward genuinely better second chapters, built on lessons the first painful experience had, however unwillingly, taught them. Let both of these women rest in your mind now side by side, neither one cancelling out the other's story. One, worn down by a system that offered her in the end very little genuine recourse. The other gradually, imperfectly, finding her way towards something better, carrying forward everything her own difficult earlier chapter had taught her. Both stories are true. Both belong in any honest accounting of what this era actually cost, and occasionally eventually offered the women who lived through it. It is worth pausing now, this late in the evening, to consider what happened to these houses themselves, once the marriages and fortunes and quiet private struggles we have spent tonight tracing had all, in their various ways, run their course. Because the buildings, unlike so much of what happened inside them, largely survived, and the way they survived tells its own quiet story about memory, preservation, and what a later era chooses to notice. Many of the grandest Newport cottages faced near demolition in the middle decades of the 20th century, their original owners' fortunes diminished or dispersed, their enormous scale and staffing requirements increasingly impractical in a world that no longer supported households of 30 or more live-in servants. Several were saved only through the deliberate intervention of local preservation societies, organised specifically to prevent these houses from being torn down for more economical development, their grounds subdivided, their marble sold for scrap. The house with the concealed third floor we discussed earlier tonight survives today as a museum. Its narrow back staircase is now walked by, paying visitors on specialised tours rather than by the housemaids and footmen who once used them daily and invisibly. The house on the Hudson River we mentioned in connection with the railroad fortune similarly survives, its picture gallery and private office preserved much as they stood during its builder's lifetime, its grounds now open to visitors who arrive by the busload rather than by private carriage. There is something genuinely valuable in this preservation, and we should not undersell it. These houses offer in their surviving architecture a kind of physical evidence for exactly the story we have spent tonight telling, evidence that would otherwise exist only in scattered letters and legal filings, difficult to access and easy to overlook. Standing in a concealed servant's corridor, or beside a false panel in a panelled wall, or within a small quiet sitting room clearly built for something other than entertaining guests, offers a kind of understanding that no written account, however detailed, can fully replace. But preservation is also, inevitably, a form of selection, and it is worth noticing gently what gets preserved and what does not. The grand ballrooms, dining rooms, and formal parlours of these houses are almost universally restored to their original splendour, their furniture, art, and decoration maintained or carefully reconstructed with considerable expense and expertise. The smaller, more private spaces we have spent so much of tonight discussing, the hidden drawers, the modest sitting rooms set aside for grief, the medicine cabinets tucked into dressing rooms, receive, by comparison, considerably less attention when they receive any attention at all. This is not necessarily anyone's deliberate choice. Museums operate within real budget constraints, and grand, photogenic rooms understandably draw more visitor interest, and therefore more preservation funding, than modest private spaces whose significance requires context and explanation to fully appreciate. But the effect, whatever its cause, is a kind of quiet second concealment layered on top of the original one, the private struggles and small resistances of these houses' female occupants receiving, in their afterlife as museums, roughly the same limited visibility they received during their actual lifetimes. Several of these historic house museums have, in recent years, begun deliberately correcting this imbalance, developing specialised tours focused specifically on servants' lives, on the private experiences of the women who lived in these houses, on exactly the kind of hidden architecture we have spent tonight exploring. The servant life tours now offered at several of the grandest Newport cottages represent exactly this kind of corrective effort, walking visitors through spaces and stories that the standard tour focused on grandeur and craftsmanship tends to pass by relatively quickly. This shift matters, and it is worth taking a moment to appreciate it before we move toward the quieter conclusion of tonight's story. For most of the 20th century, these houses were preserved and presented primarily as monuments to their builders' wealth and taste, their architecture celebrated, their original social function largely uninterrogated. The more recent turn toward examining the lives of servants, of wives, of everyone whose labour and whose quiet private struggles actually made these houses function, represents a genuine expansion of what we consider worth preserving and worth telling visitors about. Consider, as this chapter settles, the strange afterlife of an object like the false-bottomed jewellery box we discussed earlier tonight, if it happens to survive at all in one of these house museums' collections. It might be displayed today in a glass case, labelled simply as an example of Gilded Age craftsmanship, its original purpose as a place to hide letters or savings, or evidence of an independent life mentioned only briefly, if at all, in the small printed card beside it. The object survives. Its full original meaning, more often than not, does not survive quite so completely alongside it. This is, in its own way, one final version of the same pattern we have traced all evening. A house built to conceal certain things from certain people finds, over a century later, that some of what it concealed remains concealed still, not through any locked panel or hidden drawer, but simply through the ordinary, unremarkable process of a museum choosing what to emphasize and what to let pass by with only a brief mention. The architecture of concealment did not end when these houses became public institutions. It simply changed shape, moving from locked doors to curatorial choices, from private secrets to institutional priorities. And yet, here we are tonight, walking slowly and patiently through exactly the rooms and stories that so many official tours pass by quickly, giving them the unhurried attention they have so rarely received. There is something quietly worthwhile in that, even within a story built primarily to help you rest. Attention itself, however unofficial, however late at night, is its own small form of restoration, returning weight and dimension to lives that history's more official channels have so often flattened into brief mentions and passing footnotes. Let this settle now, alongside everything else you have gathered tonight. The houses still stand. Some of their most important rooms still wait, patiently, for someone willing to walk slowly enough and stay long enough to notice what the grander rooms around them have always tended to overshadow. Perhaps that is, in the end, the truest kind of hidden room in this entire story, not a space cut into a wall, but a story cut into the margins of a larger, more famous narrative, waiting for exactly the kind of unhurried attention you have been giving it tonight. We have spent most of tonight inside individual rooms, individual marriages, individual quiet acts of concealment and resistance. It is worth widening the lens now, just briefly, to look at the slower, larger machinery that eventually, gradually, began dismantling the legal architecture that made so many of these hidden rooms necessary in the first place. For most of the 19th century, the legal doctrine governing marriage in the United States held that a wife's legal identity was absorbed entirely into her husband's the moment she married, a principle inherited from English common law and applied with remarkable consistency across American courts for generations. Under this doctrine, a married woman could not, in most circumstances, sign a contract in her own name, could not file a lawsuit without her husband's participation, and had no independent legal claim to wages she herself had earned. The first meaningful cracks in this structure appeared decades before the events we have discussed tonight, beginning with property acts passed state by state, starting in the 1840s, granting married women the right to hold, at minimum, property they had brought into a marriage independently of their husband's control. These early reforms were incomplete and unevenly applied, but they established a legal precedent, however narrow, that a wife's financial identity did not need to be entirely subsumed by her husband's. Progress across the following decades was slow, uneven, and frequently contested, state by state, court case by court case, each incremental expansion of married women's financial rights typically arriving only after years of advocacy by reformers who understood, with a clarity that took the broader legal system considerably longer to share, exactly how much harm the old doctrine continued causing to women trapped in exactly the kinds of marriages we have examined throughout tonight's story. The financial panics of this era, the widespread collapses that expose so many of the fortunes we have discussed tonight as considerably less secure than they had appeared, played their own unexpected role in accelerating this legal evolution. Each major collapse generated a wave of public attention toward exactly the kind of financial devastation that wives, kept legally and practically distant from their own household's true financial position, experienced with particular and often preventable severity. Legislators and reformers increasingly pointed to these documented cases as evidence that the old system's assumptions that a wife's ignorance of financial matters constituted protection rather than vulnerability no longer held up under serious scrutiny. The broader movement for women's suffrage, which we touched on earlier tonight in connection with the Marble Palace and its small pagoda-roofed tea house, developed alongside this slower legal reform around married women's financial rights, the two campaigns often overlapping in personnel, in argument, and in underlying philosophy. Activists in both movements argued, with increasing public traction as the new century approached, that a woman's exclusion from full legal and political participation rested on the same foundational assumption that women required male oversight rather than independent standing, an assumption both movements worked, patiently and across decades, to dismantle. The right to vote finally arrived at the federal level in 1920, a milestone that took considerably longer to achieve than many of its earliest advocates had hoped, and which still, even at its arrival, left significant gaps for women of colour and other marginalised groups who continued facing substantial additional barriers to actually exercising that right for decades afterward. It represented nonetheless a genuine structural shift, evidence that the old assumptions underlying coverture and its related doctrines were no longer politically or legally sustainable in their original, unmodified form. The financial reforms that had been accumulating gradually across the preceding decades continued expanding alongside this political victory, married women's property rights, broadening state by state, financial institutions slowly adjusting their practices to accommodate women managing their own accounts and their own credit, with an independence that would have been legally impossible for their grandmothers. Progress remained uneven and incomplete for decades still to come, full financial independence for married women arriving, in practical terms, considerably later than the formal legal victories might suggest. But the direction of change, however slow, was by this point unmistakable, and it is worth sitting with what that change actually meant for the specific kind of hidden rooms we have spent tonight exploring. A private ledger kept secretly in a locked drawer, necessary because a wife had no other reliable access to her own financial information, gradually became less necessary as banks began opening accounts directly in women's own names, as financial statements began arriving addressed to wives rather than exclusively to husbands, as the entire legal architecture that had made such concealment necessary slowly, unevenly, but genuinely began to dissolve. This does not mean the underlying dynamics we have traced all evening simply disappeared with the arrival of formal legal reform. Cultural habits, as we discussed a few chapters ago, tend to persist considerably longer than the legal structures that originally created them, and the broader pattern of one spouse managing a household's finances while the other remains only partially informed did not end neatly with any single piece of legislation, however significant. It continued evolving gradually and unevenly across the entire 20th century and into our own, its most extreme historical form eventually receding, but its underlying dynamic, the possibility of one partner's financial life remaining substantially opaque to the other, never entirely disappearing. We will return to this thought more directly as tonight's story draws toward its close, because it connects, in ways worth sitting with carefully, to the present moment rather than only to the historical one. For now, simply notice the shape of the larger arc. Decades of slow, uneven, hard-won legal and political change, achieved not through any single dramatic reveal, but through the patient cumulative work of reformers, activists, and, in their own quiet way, every woman in tonight's story who kept a private ledger, or built a false-bottomed drawer, or emptied a palace in a single carefully planned afternoon, each small private act of resistance adding, however invisibly at the time, to a larger current that would eventually gradually genuinely shift the ground beneath the entire system. Let this wider view settle now, alongside the smaller, more intimate stories we have gathered throughout the evening. The individual rooms mattered, and matter still, exactly as much as we have treated them tonight, but they existed within and eventually contributed to changing something considerably larger than any single house or any single marriage, a slow, patient current of reform that took the better part of a century to fully arrive, and that, in certain important respects, continues arriving still. Let us return now to where we began this evening, to the hallway with the seam in the wallpaper, the panel that looks exactly like a wall until someone who knows better leans their weight against the correct spot. We have walked a long way since that first quiet image, through mansions and marriages, through trust documents and emptied palaces, through the small, patient architecture of resistance that so many women of this era built for themselves within a system that offered them very little formal protection. Stand there again now, in your imagination, in that same low gold light. The panel is still there, exactly as it was at the start of tonight's story. But it looks different to you now than it did a few hours ago, doesn't it? you understand, in a way you perhaps did not fully understand at the beginning of the evening, exactly how much weight a space like this could hold, and exactly how many different reasons a woman of this era might have had for wanting and needing a room that did not appear on any floor plan a guest or a husband or a trustee was ever shown. Consider everything that space might have held across the many different houses and the many different women we have walked through tonight. A private ledger, kept faithfully by a woman who had no other reliable way of tracking her own finances. A packet of letters from a life that existed before, or alongside, or entirely apart from, the marriage that defined her public existence. A small, carefully saved reserve of cash, set aside dollar by dollar against a future no one else believed she needed to prepare for. Evidence of an independent legal or financial arrangement, built quietly and patiently outside her husband's knowledge or her trustee's oversight. Or perhaps in some houses the space held something gentler, a place to sit quietly with grief that society's prescribed mourning calendar had already declared complete, whether or not the actual grief agreed with that calendar. A place to hold, for 20 unrecorded minutes each evening, the ordinary tenderness of a mother sitting beside a sleeping child, unburdened for once by the constant performance her public role required of her. A place, simply, to be unobserved, in a life and a house that so rarely allowed her that particular gift. We do not know, and will likely never know, exactly what this particular hallway's hidden panel once held, or whether the woman who once lived in this house ever pressed her hand against this exact spot, feeling the seam beneath her fingers, opening a space that belonged, for whatever brief moments she used it, entirely to her. The house has kept that particular secret completely, offering us tonight only the shape of the possibility, the seam in the wallpaper, the faint discontinuity in an otherwise seamless wall. But perhaps that incompleteness is, in its own way, exactly right for how tonight's story should end. We have gathered a great deal of specific documented history this evening. Real women, real houses, real financial catastrophes, and real quiet acts of resistance, carefully verified where the historical record allows for verification. But underneath all of that specific documentation, there exists a much larger, mostly undocumented population of women who lived through this same era, in houses considerably less grand than the ones we have discussed tonight, whose private hidden rooms, literal or otherwise, left no trace in any surviving letter or legal filing, and who therefore remain in the truest sense unknown to us, own to. This particular hallway, in this particular house standing in for all of them tonight, holds space for exactly that larger, quieter population. The women whose names never made the society columns, whose marriages never collapsed dramatically enough to generate legal filings historians would later study, whose private resistances, whatever specific shape they took, remain entirely and permanently their own, unrecovered and unrecoverable by any account we could ever hope to construct, however patient and however careful. There is something worth resting in, rather than resolving in that acknowledgement. Not every hidden room needs to be found to have mattered. Not every private act of resistance needs to be documented to have been real. The woman who once, perhaps, pressed her hand against this exact seam in this exact wall, opening a space that belonged only to her, does not need us to know her name or her specific reasons for what she did to have been genuinely significant, genuinely hers, in a life that offered her very little else that could make the same claim. Let your own breathing settle into the rhythm of that acceptance now, the quiet, unhurried acceptance of not needing every question answered before you can finally rest. The house around you continues its long, patient exhale, timber and stone settling into the deepening night, exactly as they have settled every night for over a century, holding whatever secrets they still hold, offering up only as much as they choose to offer tonight or any other night. There is one more object worth walking past slowly before we begin making our way toward the end of tonight's story, an object so central to the visible performance of Gilded Age wealth that it is easy to overlook the quieter, more private role it also played in the hidden architecture we have spent the evening exploring, the jewel box. Every woman of significant means in this era possessed, at minimum, one substantial case for her jewellery, and the wealthiest women possessed several, organised by occasion, by season, by the particular category of gem or metal each piece required. These boxes were, on their visible surface, purely functional, storage for objects whose value ran into the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, pieces that needed protecting from theft, from tarnish, from the ordinary wear of careless handling. But the jewel box occupied a curious position within the household's larger architecture of ownership, because unlike almost everything else we have discussed tonight, jewellery very often belonged unambiguously to the wife who wore it. Gifts given directly to her by a husband, a father, or occasionally purchased with her own carefully saved funds, jewellery represented one of the few categories of significant value that a Gilded Age woman might hold with something approaching full uncontested ownership. This made the jewel box, in a very literal sense, one of the few genuinely private financial reserves available to many of these women, and the historical record suggests that a considerable number of them understood this fact quite clearly and made deliberate strategic use of it. Jewellery could be sold, quietly and without a trustee's approval, in ways that cash withdrawals from a trust account could not. A woman anticipating the possible collapse of a marriage, or simply wishing to maintain a private reserve of resources entirely outside her husband's awareness, might convert a portion of her jewellery into cash through a discreet transaction with a jeweller willing to handle such matters with appropriate confidentiality. We know of several documented instances of exactly this pattern. Women who, in the months or years preceding a difficult divorce, gradually and quietly reduced their visible jewellery collection, replacing certain pieces with more modest imitations or simply wearing particular items with decreasing frequency, while the genuine pieces themselves were sold, piece by careful piece, the proceeds banked separately and privately, building exactly the kind of independent financial reserve that the broader trust and coverture system was designed to prevent. This practice required a particular kind of patience and a particular kind of quiet nerve, because it depended on a husband, and often an entire household of servants, who might notice a missing necklace, not registering the gradual absence of items that had once been worn regularly to public events. Some women managed this substitution so carefully that it was only discovered, if it was discovered at all, during the formal accounting that accompanied an eventual divorce or a husband's death, when an inventory of jewellery expected on the basis of old photographs and old society column descriptions failed to match what the safe actually still contained. There is a particular kind of quiet triumph in this pattern, worth sitting with for a moment before we move on. Within a system built, in almost every dimension we have discussed tonight, to keep a wife's finances legible primarily to her husband and his chosen trustees, the jewel box represented one small corner where the opposite could sometimes be arranged, where a woman's own careful, patient management could remain genuinely illegible to the men who assumed they understood the full shape of her resources. The key to the jewel box itself carries its own small symbolic weight in this story. In many households, that particular key remained, by custom, if not always by strict necessity, in the wife's own possession, hung on a chain she wore or kept in a location only she knew, a small daily reminder that at least one lock in this enormous house answered to her authority alone. It is a modest thing, a single key among the 100 other locks and combinations that governed a Gilded Age household's daily life. But modest things, as we have discovered together many times tonight, could hold considerably more weight than their size alone might suggest. Picture that key now, resting against the collarbone of a woman getting dressed for an evening event, tucked beneath the collar of a gown so that it would not be visible to her assembled guests, present but unseen, exactly like so much of what we have discussed tonight. She reaches for it without thinking, the way anyone reaches for a familiar object worn daily for years, and for just a moment before the pins go into her hair and the final adjustments are made to her gown, she's not yet the hostess her evening requires her to become. She's simply a woman with a key, standing in a room that, for this one private moment, answers entirely to her. The jewel boxes themselves survive in considerable numbers today, scattered across museum collections and private estates, their original contents long since dispersed through inheritance or sale, their locks, in most surviving examples, no longer functional or simply left permanently open for museum display. But if you happen to see one on a future visit to any of these grand houses, take a moment to notice the lock itself, however inert it may now be, and consider everything it once represented, one small, genuinely private corner within an otherwise thoroughly observed and thoroughly managed life. We are nearing the end of tonight's walk through these houses, and it seems right, before we finally let the story rest, to lift our eyes briefly from the 19th century and ask a quieter, gentler version of the question this entire evening has been circling. Not whether the law changed, because we have already traced across the last several chapters how genuinely and how substantially it did. The question worth sitting with instead, as the house around you finally begins to settle toward true stillness, is whether the deeper pattern beneath the law, the particular silence between a question and the decision not to ask it, has changed quite so completely. The formal architecture of concealment we spent tonight examining, trusts managed without a wife's knowledge, safes without shared combinations, entire financial lives conducted in a legal language a wife had no standing to challenge, belongs unambiguously to its own historical era. No modern legal system permits the kind of wholesale financial erasure that women like the ones in tonight's story endured as an ordinary, unremarkable condition of marriage. That specific architecture is gone, and its absence represents genuine hard-won progress, achieved through decades of patient reform we should not undersell or take for granted. But the cultural habits that grew up alongside that old legal architecture, the quiet assumption that one partner in a marriage might reasonably manage the finances while the other remains only generally informed, the social discomfort that can still, even now, attach itself to a spouse who asks too many detailed questions about household money, the particular loneliness of discovering, well into a marriage, that one's own financial picture was considerably less clear than one had assumed, these patterns proved considerably more resilient than the legal structures that first gave rise to them. They persisted, in gentler and more voluntary forms, long after coverture itself had been formally dismantled. This is not a claim that modern marriages resemble the ones we have spent tonight examining, and it would be a disservice to the women whose stories we have told this evening to suggest any close equivalence between their near-total legal erasure and whatever more modest financial opacity might exist in a contemporary household. The differences in scale and in legal protection are enormous, and they matter enormously. But the underlying human pattern, one person managing information, the other has not fully requested or received, arising not from malice in most cases, but simply from habit, from a division of labour that felt practical in the moment and gradually calcified into something neither partner quite chose deliberately, that pattern has a longer memory than any single legal reform can fully erase. There is comfort available in this observation if you let yourself receive it gently rather than anxiously, because comfort is, after all, the purpose of the hour that is drawing us steadily toward its close tonight. The comfort is simply this: every one of the women whose stories we walk through this evening lived inside a system of concealment, considerably more absolute, considerably more legally enforced, considerably more difficult to challenge than anything most listeners tonight are likely to encounter in their own lives. And still, within that far harder system they found their rooms, they kept their ledgers, they emptied their palaces when the moment for emptying finally arrived. They built, patiently and often invisibly, whatever small private architecture of self-determination the era's much harsher constraints still allowed them to build. If they could do that inside walls considerably thicker than most of us will ever have to push against, then the smaller, gentler adjustments available in a modern life, an open conversation about household finances, a shared understanding built patiently over years rather than assumed by default, a small private space of one's own that requires no concealment at all, because it is simply, openly, respected, are not nearly so far out of reach as the weight of tonight's history might make them feel in this quiet late hour. This is not a call to action tonight of all nights. It is simply an observation, offered gently, to carry with you as this story finally winds down toward its close. The architecture of the Gilded Age is gone. Its houses stand now mostly as museums, its coverture doctrine dismantled statute by statute across more than a century of patient reform, its 400-guest ballrooms opened now to anyone who can afford the price of an ordinary museum ticket. What remains, quieter and harder to fully dismantle because it was never written into any single law, is simply the old habit of silence, and that habit, unlike the legal structures that first encouraged it, has never required anyone's permission to finally begin changing. Let this thought settle now, unhurried, the way every thought tonight has been allowed to settle before we moved on to the next. There is nothing more to resolve here before sleep, only this last, gentle observation to carry with you into whatever rest is waiting on the other side of tonight's story. Before we begin making our way toward the final rooms of tonight's story, let us pause once more inside the marble palace we have returned to several times this evening, because there is one more room within it worth sitting with, a bedroom belonging not to the mistress of the house but to her daughter, in the years immediately before the wedding we discussed several chapters ago. The room itself survives today largely as it was originally furnished, a comfortable, well-appointed space by any ordinary measure, its windows overlooking the same manicured grounds where suffrage rallies would eventually gather decades later beneath a small pagoda-roofed tea-house. For a young woman raised within this house, it would have represented on its surface every comfort her considerable family fortune could arrange. But surviving accounts describe a very different emotional texture to the years this young woman spent in that room, particularly as her mother's plans for a strategic marriage to a British duke began to solidify into something increasingly difficult to resist. She had, by her own later account, formed a genuine attachment to a young man her mother considered financially unsuitable, and the months leading up to her eventual wedding were marked, according to letters and later recollections, by a sustained and increasingly forceful campaign on her mother's part to end that attachment and secure her compliance with the marriage that had already been substantially negotiated on her behalf. The specific tactics involved, according to the daughter's own later telling, included confining her within the house for extended periods, limiting her contact with the young man she preferred, and applying a sustained emotional pressure that she would later describe in a memoir written decades afterward, as having left her feeling she had no genuine choice remaining by the time the wedding day itself finally arrived. It is a difficult account to sit with, even from this distance, and we should hold it honestly rather than softening its edges simply because the hour is late and the purpose of tonight's story is rest. What matters for our purposes tonight, in a room we have returned to several times this evening for very different reasons, is the particular irony embedded in its later history. The same house that once served as the site of a young woman's confinement and pressured compliance would, within a matter of years, become one of the country's most significant gathering places for a movement explicitly dedicated to expanding women's autonomy and self-determination. The mother who orchestrated her daughter's difficult marriage would go on, in her own later chapters, to become one of the era's most significant funders of exactly the kind of movement that argued, at its core, against precisely the assumption that had governed her own daughter's wedding, that a woman's preferences could reasonably be subordinated to a family's larger strategic interests. We should be careful not to resolve this tension too neatly, because it does not resolve neatly. The mother's later suffrage activism does not erase or excuse the pressure she applied to her own daughter years earlier. Both things are true simultaneously. A woman capable of genuine, historically significant advocacy for women's broader rights, and, in her own household, capable of the same kind of coercive pressure the broader movement she later funded was explicitly organized to oppose. People even the most historically significant among them rarely arrive at consistency all at once, and this particular mother and daughter's complicated relationship offers a useful, if uncomfortable, reminder of exactly that fact. The daughter's own life, as we discussed several chapters ago, did not end where her difficult wedding day began. She went on, across the following decades, to build a life of considerable independence and genuine accomplishment, her own charitable and political work eventually rivaling her mother's in scope and significance. Whatever room she occupied, literally or figuratively, in the years leading up to her wedding, she did not remain confined to it. She built, gradually and deliberately, considerably larger rooms for herself across the remainder of her long life. There is something worth carrying forward from this particular story as tonight's account draws closer to its end. The hidden rooms we have spent the evening discussing were not always simply spaces of refuge or resistance. Sometimes, as in this case, a room could hold genuine confinement and genuine coercion, the opposite of the autonomy so many other women in tonight's story worked so patiently to claim for themselves. It is important that this account holds space for that harder truth alongside all the gentler ones, because an honest history of this era, even one told slowly and softly for the purpose of easing you towards sleep, should not simplify its subjects into either pure victims or pure heroines. The room in the marble palace remains today much as it was then, its windows still overlooking the same grounds, its furnishings still comfortable by any ordinary measure. Visitors who walk through it now, on the standard daytime tour, rarely receive more than a brief mention of the young woman's difficult years within it, the tour's attention drawn instead, understandably enough, toward the grandeur of the room's decoration and the fame of the wedding it eventually led to. But if you let yourself sit with it a little longer than the tour typically allows, as we have tonight, something of its more complicated history becomes available, not to resolve, necessarily, but simply to hold, honestly, alongside everything else this house has offered us this evening. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. Let us close this particular thread of tonight's story with a gentler figure, a woman known across Gilded Age society less for hidden rooms than for a wit sharp enough to occasionally embarrass the very social machine she participated in so enthusiastically, because even within the rigid, exhausting performance we discussed several chapters ago, a small handful of women found room to insert something closer to genuine irreverence. She was famous in her own era for hosting dinners of considerable extravagance, including, on one still-remembered occasion, a banquet whose guest of honour turned out, upon the evening's reveal, to be a monkey dressed formally in evening attire, a joke that cost a genuinely significant sum of money to arrange, and that scandalised precisely the segment of society it was designed to scandalise. It was an odd, theatrical gesture, and it tells us something worth holding on to as tonight's story winds toward its close. Within a social world built almost entirely around careful, unrelenting performance, where a single misstep in dress or hospitality could genuinely threaten a family's entire standing, this particular woman carved out a reputation for herself as someone willing to gently mock the very rules she was, in every practical sense, still fully obligated to follow. She hosted her 400 guests. She spent the fortunes the season required. But she did so, by most surviving accounts, with a visible awareness of the absurdity of the whole arrangement that few of her more solemn peers ever allowed themselves to display publicly. This matters for our purposes tonight, because it offers one more variation on the theme we have spent the entire evening exploring, the different ways women within this rigid system found room to exercise something like genuine autonomy. Some built hidden drawers, some emptied palaces in a single planned afternoon. Some gave their fortunes away to outlast their family's financial collapse. And at least one, it seems, simply decided that if she could not escape the performance entirely, she could at least occasionally turn it gently and expensively into a joke only she and a select few guests were fully in on. There is a particular kind of freedom in that approach worth sitting with as we move toward the quieter final chapters of tonight's story. Not every act of resistance needs to be solemn or secretive or built around genuine financial risk. Sometimes resistance can look simply like refusing to take entirely seriously a system that demands, above almost everything else, to be taken with absolute humorless seriousness. A woman who could host a monkey in evening dress and watch her most solemn peers struggle to determine whether they were meant to be amused or offended had found, in her own particular way, a hidden room too, not built of walls or drawers, but of a perspective the rest of her social world simply did not share. We know relatively little about her private life beyond these public performances, which is itself worth noting, because it means we cannot say with confidence whether her wit extended into the same kinds of quiet, financial vigilance, and private resistance we have documented in several other women tonight, or whether her particular gift was simply for social theatre, rather than for the harder, more consequential kinds of self-determination other women in tonight's story pursued. Both possibilities feel plausible, and perhaps, in the end, both were simply true of her at different moments, in different rooms, on different evenings. What she offers us, regardless, is a useful reminder as tonight's account nears its conclusion. The women of this era were not a single archetype, uniformly victimized or uniformly resourceful, uniformly solemn or uniformly playful. They were, as any honest accounting of any group of people across any era must eventually acknowledge, considerably more varied than any single documentary narrative, however patient, can ever fully capture. Some hid ledgers, some hosted monkeys, some did both on different nights, according to whatever mood or necessity the particular evening required. Let this variety settle alongside everything else you've gathered tonight. One more thread woven into the larger tapestry we have been slowly, patiently constructing across the last several hours, there is comfort somehow, in variety itself, in the reminder that even within the most rigid and exhausting systems, human personality finds its way through in forms as different as a locked drawer and a monkey in evening dress, each one, in its own particular way, a small assertion that the person behind the performance remained, however constrained, genuinely and irreducibly herself. Almost everything we know about the private hidden rooms of this evening's story survives through an accident of preservation. Letters that happen to be kept rather than destroyed, diaries that happen to pass down through a family rather than being discarded by an indifferent later generation, legal filings that happen to become part of a public record because a marriage happened to end badly enough to require one. It is worth spending a little time this late in the evening considering how thin and how fortunate this thread of survival actually is. For every letter that survives in an archive today describing a woman's private financial ledger, or her quiet evening ritual of grief beside a burning candle, there were almost certainly dozens or hundreds of similar letters that did not survive, destroyed deliberately by their authors before death, or simply lost across the ordinary churn of moving households, changing generations, and the slow decay that eventually claims most paper, unless someone makes a specific, sustained effort to prevent it. Many of these women, we should remember, would likely have been horrified by the idea of their private correspondence surviving for public examination more than a century later. The letters we have drawn on throughout tonight's story were, in almost every case, written for an audience of one, a trusted sister, a close friend, occasionally simply for the writer's own private reflection. Their survival into the historical record represents, in most cases, not the author's intention, but rather the accumulated effect of family archives, historical societies, and eventually academic researchers who recognized value in documents their original authors likely assumed would remain permanently private. This creates a particular kind of responsibility for anyone telling this story, tonight included, a responsibility to hold these private words with the same care and discretion their original authors likely would have wanted extended to them, even while recognizing that their broader historical value, the light they shed on lives and experiences the official record so often overlooked entirely, justifies their eventual careful use. We have tried, across tonight's account, to honour both of these obligations, drawing on documented patterns and general historical understanding, rather than reproducing any woman's most intimate words verbatim, offering instead the shape and texture of what survives, without claiming a false intimacy with details that belong, in the end, to the women who actually lived them. It is worth acknowledging, too, that the very fact of preservation carries its own bias. Letters survive more reliably in families of sufficient wealth to maintain organised archives across generations, which means the women whose private lives we can most reliably reconstruct tonight were, almost without exception, women of considerable means, exactly the women whose stories fill tonight's account. The vast majority of women who lived through this same era, in households of far more modest means, left behind considerably less documentation and their own versions of tonight's hidden rooms, their own quiet ledgers and private grievings and small acts of resistance, remained for the most part entirely lost to us. This should not diminish the value of the stories we have gathered tonight, but it should shape how we hold them as a partial and privileged window into a much larger, much less documented human experience, rather than as a complete accounting of what women across this entire era actually lived through. The specific women we have discussed by implication tonight, the ones whose stories became documented enough to reconstruct with confidence, represent a narrow, wealthy slice of a much broader population whose private struggles and private resistances we can only imagine, by extension and by careful, respectful inference, rather than document directly. There is a kind of humility worth carrying into the final chapters of tonight's story because of this. Everything we have discussed this evening is true, as best as careful historical research can establish truth from surviving fragments, and yet everything we have discussed also represents only a fraction of what was actually lived, felt, hidden, and resisted across this entire era, by women whose names and stories will never reach us, whose hidden rooms, wherever and whatever they were, remain permanently and irretrievably their own. Perhaps that is, in its own way, exactly as it should be. Not every private room needs to be discovered to have mattered. Not every act of quiet resistance needs to survive into a documentary account, told slowly by candlelight more than a century later, to have been genuinely significant to the woman who performed it, in whatever moment she performed it, for whatever private reasons were entirely her own. The historical record we have drawn on tonight offers us a window, generous but partial, into a much larger, largely silent population of lives lived under similar constraints, similar quiet resourcefulness, similar hidden rooms we will simply never know enough to describe. Let this thought settle gently now, the way every difficult thought tonight has eventually been allowed to settle. There is comfort even here in the acknowledgement of what remains unknown, a reminder that history, however carefully researched, is always incomplete, always partial, always leaving room for exactly the kind of quiet, unrecorded human dignity that no archive, however thorough, could ever hope to fully capture or fully contain. It is time now, gently, to begin making our way back through this house, toward the place where tonight's story began, down the same corridors we walked at the very start of the evening, past rooms that hold considerably more weight for you now than they did a few hours ago, when this was simply an unfamiliar hallway and a seam in the wallpaper you had not yet learned to notice. Walk slowly. There is no reason to hurry through any of this. Let your hand trail lightly along the panelled wall as you pass, feeling for nothing in particular, simply allowing the texture of old, carefully maintained wood to accompany you the way it accompanied so many of the women whose stories we have spent tonight exploring. Women who walked these same kinds of corridors thousands of times across the span of their own lives, developing over years an intimate physical familiarity with every turn and every threshold, even in houses that kept so much of their true architecture, financial and legal, deliberately hidden from them. Past the writing desk where we imagined a private ledger being kept, its drawers empty now but still, somehow, carrying the faint suggestion of the careful, patient accounting that once filled them. Past the small sitting room where grief, uninvited by any calendar, once lingered quietly for as long as it needed to, unwitnessed by any guest, unhurried by any social expectation to finally, visibly, conclude. Past the nursery wing, quiet now, its cribs long since removed, but still carrying, if you let yourself feel for it, the particular tenderness of those 20 unrecorded minutes a mother once claimed each evening, sitting beside a sleeping child, briefly and completely free of the performance the rest of her house required. Past the dressing room where a jewel box once held, alongside its visible gems, a much quieter private reserve, patiently built, piece by careful piece, against a future its owner alone had the foresight to prepare for. The house continues settling around you as you walk, the ordinary creaks and shifts of old timber cooling in the deepening night, each sound arriving and fading the way sounds do in any house old enough to have developed its own particular voice across more than a century of standing exactly where it stands. There is nothing alarming in these sounds tonight. They are simply the house's own quiet way of exhaling, the same way your own breathing has likely slowed and deepened across the last several hours, following the rhythm of a story told deliberately at exactly the pace true rest requires. Consider, as you walk, everything this single house has held across its long life, so much more than any single evening story could ever fully contain. Weddings and funerals, financial triumphs and financial catastrophes, children born and children lost, marriages that flourished quietly, and marriages that collapsed as dramatically as the one we traced across an ocean and an emptied palace earlier tonight. Every room you pass now held some fragment of all of this, most of it entirely unrecorded, known only to the people who actually lived it, in moments that belonged, in the end, entirely to them. You reach, eventually, the grand staircase that anchors this house's central hall, the same staircase every guest once descended on their way toward whatever dinner or ball or reception the evening required. Its marble steps are cool beneath your feet, worn very slightly smooth by more than a century of footsteps, family members and guests, and, in later decades, museum visitors like the many thousands who have walked this same path since the house began its second life as a place of public memory rather than private residence. Pause here, at the base of the stairs, and look back up toward the hallway where tonight's story began. From this distance, in this low remaining light, you cannot see the seam in the wallpaper anymore, cannot pick out the exact panel that first drew your attention several hours ago. The house has folded that particular secret back into itself, exactly as it has folded away so many other secrets across its long history, offering up only as much as it chooses to offer, to whoever happens to be listening closely enough, patiently enough, and late enough at night to actually hear it. That is perhaps the truest thing this house, or any house like it, can teach us tonight. Not a complete accounting, not a final answer, but simply the reminder that behind every visible, photographed, carefully preserved room, there exists another layer, quieter and less accessible, holding whatever private truths the people who actually lived there chose, for whatever reasons were entirely their own, to keep just out of sight. Some of those truths we have managed to recover a little of tonight, through careful research and patient attention. Most of them remain, and will likely always remain, genuinely and permanently hidden, exactly as their original owners likely intended. Let yourself rest in that incompleteness now, as we approach the very end of tonight's story. You do not need every answer to have received something real and valuable from this evening's walk through these quiet, patient rooms. Sometimes the most honest ending a story like this can offer is simply an acknowledgement of everything it could not fully uncover, offered gently, without anxiety, as one more small comfort to carry with you into whatever rest is waiting just beyond these final words. Before we let this house fall entirely silent for the night, there is one last quiet observation worth making about the marble itself, the actual stone that makes up so much of what we have walked through this evening, because stone, unlike paper, unlike memory, unlike even the most carefully preserved letter, holds its own particular relationship to time. The marble quarried for these houses travelled enormous distances to arrive at its final destination. Blocks cut from quarries across Europe, shipped across an ocean, carved and polished and fitted into place by craftsmen whose own names rarely survive alongside the buildings they built. 500,000 cubic feet of it, in the case of the house we have returned to most often tonight, enough stone to have taken years simply to transport and assemble, long before any furniture arrived, long before any family ever walked through its finished halls. Stone like this does not remember in the way we mean when we use that word for people. It does not hold images, or feelings, or the specific texture of a particular Tuesday morning more than a century ago. But it does hold, in a more literal and more patient sense, the actual physical trace of everything that happened near it, cool where hands once rested against it during difficult conversations, faintly worn where feet passed over it thousands of times across decades of daily use, its surfaces recording in the most minimal and undramatic way imaginable the sheer accumulated weight of so much ordinary human presence. There is something worth sitting with in the contrast between this patient, undramatic stone and the frantic, urgent human drama we have spent tonight tracing through it. Fortunes rising and collapsing within a matter of years, marriages formed and dissolved within a decade, entire lives compressed into the newspaper columns that briefly, breathlessly covered them before moving on to the next season's scandal. The marble simply continued standing, unhurried, indifferent in the gentlest possible sense to whichever particular human drama happened to be unfolding within its walls during any given decade. This indifference is not coldness exactly, though it can feel that way if you consider it too quickly. It is closer to a kind of patience that no human life, however long, can quite match, a willingness to simply continue existing, unchanged in its essential nature, while generation after generation of much shorter-lived human concerns rise and fall around it. The women whose stories we have spent tonight exploring lived, on average, considerably shorter lives than the buildings that housed them, and every one of the fortunes, marriages, and private struggles we have traced this evening has, by now fully concluded, resolved one way or another into whatever final shape history eventually settled on for it. The marble, meanwhile, simply continues, cooler now perhaps than it once was, kept at a controlled museum temperature rather than heated by the enormous coal furnaces that once warmed these houses through their brief but demanding social seasons, but otherwise largely unchanged. The same stone, quarried by the same distant hands, still holding its position exactly where it was originally set more than a century ago. There is a particular kind of comfort available in this thought, if you let yourself receive it gently as tonight's story finally approaches its end. Whatever difficulty, whatever hidden grief or hidden resistance, whatever quiet private struggle any woman in tonight's story once carried through these halls, the stone itself absorbed none of it in any burdensome sense. It simply held space, patient and unchanging, for exactly as long as it was needed, and continues holding that same patient space now for whoever happens to walk through it next, carrying whatever weight their own particular life requires them to carry. Perhaps this is worth extending gently to your own experience of tonight's story as it finally draws to its close. You have carried, across the last several hours, the weight of quite a lot: financial betrayal and quiet resistance, genuine grief and genuine resourcefulness, marriages that collapsed and marriages that eventually found their way towards something better. It is enough now simply to set that weight down, the way a hand finally lifts away from a cool marble wall after resting there through a difficult moment, leaving the stone exactly as patient and exactly as steady as it was before, ready to hold whatever comes next. The house around you has grown very quiet now. Even the faint sounds of settling timber we noticed earlier have largely faded, the building finally reaching that particular late stillness that old houses reach only very late at night, when even their own subtle creaks and shifts have finally mostly subsided. It is perhaps the closest thing a building can offer to actual sleep, and it feels, at this hour, like an invitation extended to you as well, gently, without any urgency behind it. Before we let the house fall completely silent, let us drift briefly north, along the Hudson River, to a different kind of Gilded Age residence entirely, one built not in the marble and gold of Newport, but in the pointed arches and grey stone of the Gothic revival, a style meant to evoke not classical permanence but medieval mystery, shadowed corridors and stained glass and the particular hush that Gothic architecture has always specialised in creating. This house belonged to the railroad financier, whose son, as we discussed several chapters ago, would eventually lose the bulk of the family fortune through a series of disastrous expansion projects. But in the father's own lifetime, this river estate functioned as something closer to a genuine sanctuary, a place he retreated to specifically to escape the ruthless, exhausting persona his Wall Street reputation required him to maintain in the city. Here, by most surviving accounts, he became simply a father and a husband, tending an elaborate greenhouse collection, walking the grounds with his children, allowing himself a private gentleness that his public reputation as one of the era's most feared financial operators rarely permitted him to display. The house itself, with its pointed Gothic windows and its shadowed stone corridors, offers its own particular version of the architecture of concealment we have spent tonight exploring, though here the concealment operated in a slightly different direction. Rather than hiding a wife's finances from her, or hiding a husband's debts from public view, this house seems to have functioned primarily to hide its owner's own private tenderness from a business world that would have considered any visible softness a dangerous liability. His daughter, who inherited a significant portion of the estate and continued living there for decades after his death, used the house's considerable grounds for exactly the kind of quiet philanthropic work we discussed several chapters ago, funding hospitals, supporting soldiers, building libraries, all conducted with a steadiness that seemed entirely undisturbed by her brother's simultaneous financial collapse elsewhere in the family's holdings. The Gothic windows that had once sheltered her father's private gentleness came, in her own tenure, to shelter her own considerable, if quieter, form of independent purpose. There is a particular kind of hidden room contained within a house like this, one we have not quite named directly yet tonight, though we have circled it several times. Call it the room where a person's public performance and private self diverge most sharply, the space, sometimes literal, sometimes simply emotional, where a ruthless financier becomes, briefly and genuinely, a tender father, or where a rigid society hostess becomes, behind a closed door, a woman quietly worried about debts she's not supposed to know exist. Every figure in tonight's story in some sense maintained a room like this, a private self that did not entirely match the public performance their era demanded of them. The financier who terrified Wall Street and gently tended greenhouse orchids on weekends. The heiress who hosted lavish dinners while secretly liquidating her jewellery to build an independent reserve. The bride who smiled radiantly for wedding photographs while crying behind a veil thick enough to hide it. Each of these divergences represents its own small, private architecture of concealment, distinct from the locked drawers and hidden panels we have discussed more literally tonight, but no less real for existing primarily in the gap between a person's public role and their private experience. The Gothic house along the river survives today as a public museum, its greenhouse largely gone, its grounds maintained by a preservation trust rather than by the family that once tended them personally. Visitors walk its shadowed stone corridors now on guided tours that emphasize, understandably, the building's architectural significance and its connections to a well-known era of American finance. Fewer tours linger long on the quieter, more private story of a feared financier finding within these particular walls room to simply be gentle, or of his daughter finding, within the same walls decades later, room to build a legacy entirely her own, independent of her brother's more publicized failures. Let this last house settle alongside everything else we have gathered tonight, one final example of how thoroughly this era's grandest buildings served double duty: visible monuments to wealth and status on one hand, private sanctuaries for whatever gentler or more complicated truths their occupants needed shelter from public view on the other. The Gothic windows still catch the morning light exactly as they always have. The river still moves past exactly as patiently as the marble we discussed a few chapters ago, and somewhere within those shadowed stone walls, the memory of a ruthless man's private gentleness lingers still, quiet and mostly unremarked upon, waiting like so much else in tonight's story, for whoever is patient enough to notice it. One final story deserves a slow return before tonight's account fully rests, because it offers, perhaps more clearly than any other single image we have gathered this evening, the precise difference between a fortune built on performance and a gift built on something more genuine, and it brings us back, gently, to where several of tonight's threads first began. We spoke earlier of a financier whose fortune, built across railroads and city transit, and eventually an ambitious London subway project, turned out upon his death to be almost entirely leveraged, 95 cents of debt behind every dollar of apparent wealth, a mansion with platinum-plated doors that was, by the time the lawyers finished their accounting, already effectively the property of his creditors. Nearly everything he built during his lifetime existed within this same fragile architecture, magnificent on the surface, hollow underneath, sustained only by the continued willingness of banks and investors to keep extending credit against assets that were, in many cases, already pledged several times over. There was one exception. Years before his death, at what seemed at the time the height of his success, he donated funds to a university observatory, purchasing what would become, for a time, the largest refracting telescope in the world, a gift given outright, with no strings attached and no collateral pledged against it. Whatever his motivations, and the historical record suggests they included no small measure of a desire for the kind of respectable, lasting legacy his earlier prison sentence had complicated, the gift itself was structured entirely differently from every other transaction in his sprawling financial life. It was simply given. It could not be repossessed. When the rest of his empire collapsed, when the mansion was sold and the art auctioned and the household staff dismissed, the telescope remained precisely where it had always been, untouched by the catastrophe unfolding around every other asset he had ever claimed to own. It continued its patient work, gathering starlight from distances so vast that the light itself had begun its journey, long before any human fortune, however large, had ever existed to be built or lost. There is something worth holding on to in this contrast as tonight's story finally winds toward its close. So much of what we have discussed this evening involved performance, wealth displayed rather than genuinely possessed, confidence projected rather than actually felt, marriages maintained on the surface while collapsing quietly underneath. The telescope represents the rare exception, a single genuine unconditional gift within an entire life, otherwise built on leverage and appearance. And it is worth noticing that this one honest thing was also, in the end, the only thing that actually survived intact. The mansion on Fifth Avenue, with its platinum doors and its gallery of borrowed grandeur, is gone now entirely, replaced, as we mentioned earlier tonight, by an ordinary garden. Grass grows now where a fortune's most elaborate performance of permanence once stood. But the telescope, built on nothing but genuine, unconditional generosity, still operates, still gathers its patient starlight, still stands as the one truly permanent thing an otherwise entirely impermanent life managed to create. Perhaps this offers, as much as anything else we have discussed tonight, the quiet lesson this entire evening has been circling without ever quite naming directly. The hidden rooms we have spent so many hours exploring, the locked drawers and false bottom boxes and private ledgers, existed because so much of this era's visible wealth was itself a kind of performance, fragile and ultimately unsustainable, requiring constant concealment to maintain its appearance of permanence. The things that actually lasted in nearly every story we have told tonight were the genuine things, freely given, honestly built, unconditionally offered, whether a telescope pointed at the stars or an institution funded by a woman who chose to give her fortune away before it could be lost, or simply the quiet, patient loyalty of a lady's maid who helped her mistress build a genuinely independent life, expecting nothing in return beyond the ordinary, sustaining warmth of the relationship itself. Let this thought settle now, gently, as the very last full idea we will carry through tonight's story before we finally let everything rest. Grass grows now where the platinum doors once stood, but somewhere, on a clear night, a telescope built from one honest gift still gathers starlight exactly as patiently as it always has, indifferent to every fortune that rose and collapsed around it, indifferent even to the name of the man who funded it, simply continuing its quiet, genuine work exactly as it was always meant to. There is one final number worth sitting with tonight, quietly, before we let this story rest entirely, a number that helps place every individual story we have told this evening within its proper, much larger context. Between the 1870s and the beginning of the First World War, historians estimate that somewhere in the neighbourhood of 450 American heiresses crossed the Atlantic to marry European titles, each one, in her own particular way, entering into some version of the arrangement we traced earlier tonight through the Marble Palace and its eventual empty afternoon. 450 marriages, 450 young women, most of them barely into adulthood, negotiated into unions that combined American fortune with European rank, according to terms that were, in case after documented case, arranged with only glancing attention paid to the bride's own preferences. Some of these marriages, like the one we discussed at length several chapters ago, ended in difficult, well-documented divorces. Many others simply continued for decades, their private texture never fully entering the historical record, their own hidden rooms, whatever specific shape they took, remaining as unknown to us as the vast majority of quieter, less wealthy marriages we discussed a few chapters back. A reference volume published during this era, listing which American women had married which European nobles, along with the general financial terms of each settlement, ran through multiple editions, purchased by families anxious to track the ongoing progress of this particular social and financial marketplace. It listed names and titles and estates. It did not list, because no one considered it relevant information for the volume's purposes, how many of these young women wept behind their wedding veils, or discovered years later exactly how thoroughly their fortunes had already been spent, or quietly began building their own hidden reserves of savings and independence within marriages that had started from the very beginning as a financial transaction rather than a partnership of equals. It is worth sitting for just a moment longer with the sheer scale suggested by that number. 450 separate versions of the same essential story, each one distinct in its particular details, but sharing, underneath those details, the same fundamental architecture we have spent tonight examining: trusts managed by men, finances hidden from wives, social pressure to perform a confidence in family prosperity that individual women were rarely permitted to actually verify for themselves, legal structures differing somewhat between American and European jurisdictions but broadly similar in their underlying assumptions, that made questioning a husband's management of shared finances both procedurally difficult and, just as importantly, socially unacceptable. The women in tonight's more detailed stories, the wife with the safe and the locksmith, the bride who emptied a palace in a single afternoon, the young duchess crying behind her veil, represent in this larger context simply the small handful of cases detailed and dramatic enough to survive clearly into the historical record. For every one of their stories, 300 or 400 other, less thoroughly documented versions of the same essential experience unfolded quietly across the same decades, in marriages and mansions whose full private history we will likely never have the opportunity to reconstruct with any real confidence. This is worth carrying with you as tonight's story finally, gently, comes to its close. The specific women we have named and detailed tonight matter, and their stories deserve exactly the careful, unhurried attention we have given them across this long evening. But they also stand, in this final accounting, for something considerably larger than themselves, an entire generation of women who lived through a particular, historically specific arrangement between American money and European rank, American fortune and European title, each one navigating in her own private way the same fundamental questions of trust, autonomy, and hidden truth that we have spent the whole of tonight exploring through their more thoroughly documented sisters. The system that produced these 450 marriages has long since ended, dissolved by changing economic conditions, changing social attitudes, and the same broader legal reforms we discussed several chapters ago. No reference volume today tracks American heiresses marrying European titles according to their financial settlements, because the entire economic logic that once made such tracking worthwhile has faded into history, alongside so much else we have discussed tonight. But the number itself, 450, remains quietly astonishing, a reminder of just how systematic, just how widespread, the particular architecture of concealment and quiet resistance we have spent this evening examining actually was, extending far beyond any single mansion or any single marriage into an entire transatlantic marketplace whose full human cost, individual story by individual story, we will likely never fully know. One last room deserves our attention before the house finally settles into full silence. A small library or reading room, present in nearly every grand house of this era, tucked usually into a quiet corner, away from the formal reception rooms, furnished with deep chairs and good lamplight and shelves of books that ranged, depending on the household, from serious literature to the popular novels of the day. This room rarely photographed well by the standards of the era's society journalism, which preferred the drama of a ballroom or the opulence of a dining table set for 40 guests. A woman reading quietly in a library chair made for a considerably less compelling photograph than the same woman descending a grand staircase in full evening dress, and so these rooms, however frequently used, appear only rarely in the surviving visual record of these houses' most celebrated moments. And yet surviving letters and diaries suggest these reading rooms functioned as genuinely important private sanctuaries for many of the women in tonight's story, spaces where a few uninterrupted hours with a book offered something that no formal social occasion, however lavish, could quite provide: simple, quiet, undemanding solitude, unstructured by any performance requirement at all. A woman need not display anything in a reading room. She need not converse, or charm, or manage a room full of guests. She need only sit and read and allow her own thoughts whatever room they required. Several of the women we have discussed tonight by implication, if not always by name, were known within their own social circles as unusually well read. Their private libraries stocked not simply with fashionable literature, but with serious works of history, philosophy, and, in a small but significant number of documented cases, precisely the kind of legal and financial material that might help a woman better understand exactly the system of trusts and coverture that otherwise kept her at such a careful, engineered distance from her own financial life. This detail is worth sitting with for a moment, because it suggests one more quiet form of resistance we have not yet fully named tonight: education pursued privately, sometimes almost secretly, as a tool for eventually understanding and perhaps even challenging a system designed to keep women at a comfortable, uninformed distance from exactly the kind of knowledge a good library could provide. A woman who spent her private reading hours working through legal texts on property and trust law was building, quietly and patiently, exactly the kind of understanding that might someday allow her to ask sharper, more informed questions of a trustee or a husband who had long assumed her incapable of asking any questions at all. We know of at least a few documented instances where this kind of quiet private education paid off in exactly this way. Women who, upon finally gaining access to their own financial records, whether through a husband's death or a hard-fought divorce, proved considerably more prepared to understand and act on what they found than anyone around them had expected. Their reading rooms, unglamorous and unphotographed as they were, had quietly equipped them for exactly the moment when understanding finally became necessary. This feels like a fitting note to close tonight's exploration of hidden rooms on, because it reframes concealment one final time, not simply as something imposed upon these women from the outside, walls built to keep them from a truth others controlled, but also, in this particular case, as something they occasionally built for themselves, a private space of quiet study that no one else in the household thought significant enough to monitor closely, precisely because no one imagined a library could hold anything as consequential as the small, patient architecture of a woman's own growing understanding. The reading rooms of these grand houses survive today, in most cases, as one more stop on the standard museum tour. Their shelves restocked with period-appropriate volumes, their deep chairs arranged for photographs rather than for actual reading. But if you let yourself imagine, for just a moment longer, the particular quality of light in such a room on an ordinary winter afternoon, a fire burning low, a woman settled into her chair with a book that few of her guests would have expected to find in her hands, you can perhaps feel something of what these rooms actually offered, beyond mere decoration, to the women who used them most faithfully across the many quiet, unphotographed hours of their long, complicated lives. There is one more small space worth visiting before we let this house, and this story finally settle into complete stillness, not a grand room, or even a particularly hidden one, but the simplest room of all, the one every single person in tonight's story, wealthy or poor, powerful or powerless, ultimately shared in common. The bedroom, at the very end of an ordinary day, in the last few minutes before sleep. Whatever performance a woman of this era maintained throughout her day, however carefully she managed her public composure through difficult dinners or difficult conversations with trustees, however skillfully she concealed a private ledger, or a private grief, or a private plan for eventual independence, there came, each night, this same simple moment. A lamp extinguished, a head resting against a pillow, a body finally permitted to stop performing anything at all. It is worth imagining gently what these final moments of an ordinary day might have actually felt like for the women whose stories we have spent tonight exploring. Perhaps a quiet review of the day's small victories and small frustrations, the way anyone's mind naturally drifts back over recent hours in the moments before sleep finally arrives. Perhaps a brief, private worry about tomorrow's obligations, the next dinner to host, the next difficult conversation to navigate. Perhaps, on calmer nights, nothing more complicated than simple, welcome tiredness, the ordinary physical exhaustion that comes at the end of any long day, regardless of the specific shape that day happened to take. This final room, unlike every other hidden space we have discussed tonight, required no architecture at all, no false panel, no locked drawer, no careful negotiation with a trustee or a husband. It arrived simply through the ordinary passage of each day into each night, available equally to the wealthiest heiress and the humblest housemaid, to the woman managing a 50-room mansion and the woman managing a small city apartment, to every person, in every era, who was ever needed at the close of a long day simply to finally stop. Perhaps this is worth carrying forward as the truest lesson of tonight's long, patient walk through so many grand and complicated rooms. Beneath every specific historical detail we have gathered this evening, beneath every documented trust and every documented divorce, beneath every hidden drawer and every emptied palace, there remains this simplest, most universal fact. Every person in tonight's story, regardless of how much wealth or how little autonomy she possessed during her waking hours, eventually arrived each night at exactly this same quiet threshold, the ordinary necessary surrender of sleep. You have arrived there too now, after this long evening's careful walk through so many rooms, so many stories, so much history gathered slowly and gently across these past several hours. There is nothing more required of you, no further room to explore tonight, no further ledger to review, no further question to answer, only this, the same simple threshold every person in tonight's story eventually reached, waiting now, patiently, for you as well. Let the last of tonight's candlelight finally gutter out completely. The house and everyone who ever lived within it has settled now into whatever stillness the night finally offers. It is, at last, entirely, simply time to rest. Let us walk once more beneath the surface of these grand estates, back down into the tunnels we mentioned only briefly at the very start of tonight's story, because they deserve one more careful pass before we let everything finally rest, and because they offer a fitting way to bring this long evening's walk full circle. Beneath several of the largest Newport cottages, stone corridors run from the main house out towards separate outbuildings, carriage houses, stables, and in later years, the mechanical rooms that house the boilers and generators required to keep an enormous house lit and heated through its brief but demanding social season. These tunnels were built for entirely practical reasons, moving coal and ice and eventually electrical equipment without disturbing the carefully maintained lawns and gardens above. But they carry in retrospect an unmistakable echo of everything else we have discussed tonight. A specialised tour offered at one of these grand houses today takes visitors down into precisely this underground world, through the boiler room and along the tunnels that once powered the entire estate. Guides sharing stories from the household's engineers and superintendents, the men who kept the invisible machinery running so smoothly that the family and their guests upstairs rarely had reason to think about it at all. It is, in its own way, one more version of the concealment we have spent all evening tracing, an entire working world existing just beneath the polished surface everyone else assumed was the whole of the house. Think of everything that travelled through corridors like these across the decades these houses stood at the height of their social importance. Coal, certainly, and ice, and the ordinary daily deliveries any large household required. But also, we might imagine on certain evenings, other things entirely, a servant carrying a discreet message between one part of the house and another, a piece of correspondence delivered quietly outside the household's normal channels. Perhaps even, on rare occasions we can only speculate about now, a woman herself, moving unseen between one part of her own vast home and another, borrowing the same invisibility these tunnels offered every other form of household traffic. We have spent tonight's entire story moving between two related but distinct kinds of hidden space. The literal architecture of concealment, panels and tunnels and locked drawers built directly into these houses' physical structure, and the more figurative hidden rooms of financial ignorance, private grief and quiet resistance that existed within the social and legal architecture of the era more broadly. These underground tunnels sit fittingly at the exact intersection of both, physical passages that also, in their practical effect, extended the same fundamental logic of invisibility that governed so much of what we have discussed this evening. It matters, too, that these tunnels required considerable engineering skill and considerable expense to build, evidence that concealment itself throughout this entire story was never simply an accident of circumstance but a deliberate resourced investment. Families spent real money ensuring that certain kinds of movement, certain kinds of labour, certain kinds of information remained safely out of view. The tunnels beneath the garden, and the hidden panels in the panelled walls and the trusts managed without a wife's full knowledge were all, in their different ways, expressions of the same underlying willingness to spend whatever was necessary to maintain a particular, carefully curated appearance. And yet, exactly as we discussed with the back staircases many chapters ago, architecture built for one purpose does not always remain confined to that purpose. The same underground corridors built to keep coal deliveries invisible to a Newport garden party occasionally, in ways the historical record only hints at rather than fully documents, served other quiet purposes as well, however modest and however undocumented those additional purposes remain to us now. The tunnels are open to visitors today, lit now by modern electric fixtures rather than the gas lamps or early bulbs that once guided a household engineer through his nightly rounds. Tourists walk them now with considerably more curiosity than anxiety, marvelling at the scale of engineering required to keep a Gilded Age mansion functioning smoothly, rarely pausing to consider the deeper metaphor these underground passages offer for everything else this era's grand houses concealed within their far more visible, far more celebrated rooms above. Let this final underground image settle now, alongside every other room we have visited across this long evening. A tunnel beneath a garden, built for coal and ice, carrying, perhaps, considerably more than that across the many decades it operated in genuine secrecy. It is a fitting note to bring us back gently to where tonight's story first began, in a hallway with a seam in the wallpaper, a door built to look exactly like a wall, patient and waiting, holding whatever it still holds for as long as it needs to hold it. One final reflection, before the candle finally goes out completely, on the act of walking through a house like this one at all, because the way we choose to move through these preserved rooms, tonight and on any ordinary daytime visit, says something worth noticing about what we as a much later era have decided is worth lingering over, and what we have decided, mostly without deciding it deliberately, to simply walk past. A standard daytime tour of any of these grand houses moves at a brisk, efficient pace, guides trained to deliver a set amount of information within a set amount of time, groups of visitors shuffling from the entrance hall to the dining room to the ballroom according to a route optimized for crowd flow rather than for reflection. There is nothing wrong with this. Museums operate under real constraints, and the brisk pace serves most visitors, most of the time, reasonably well. But it means that the smaller, quieter rooms we have spent tonight exploring so slowly, the modest sitting room set aside for grief, the reading room no one thought to photograph, the writing desk with its long empty hidden drawer, receive, on an ordinary tour, only a fraction of the attention we have given them across this long, unhurried evening. A guide might mention such a room in passing, a single sentence noting its original function, before the group moves on toward whichever grander space waits next on the standard route. This is not a criticism of the guides, who generally do remarkable work condensing an enormous amount of history into a manageable hour or two for visitors who have their own schedules and their own limits on attention and patience. It is simply an observation about what gets emphasized when time is genuinely scarce and grand. Photogenic rooms will nearly always win that competition over smaller, quieter ones, regardless of which rooms actually held more of a house's genuine private history. Tonight, we have had the rare luxury of moving in the opposite direction, lingering exactly where a standard tour would hurry past, treating the modest writing desk with the same careful attention as the gilded ballroom, because the purpose of this particular walk through this particular house was never simply to admire craftsmanship or scale. It was to notice, patiently and without hurry, the fuller human story that so often gets compressed into a single passing sentence on a faster tour. There is something worth carrying forward from this contrast gently as tonight's story finally approaches its true end. Attention itself, offered without hurry, is a kind of gift, both to the history being examined and, in its own quiet way, to whoever offers it. We rarely have the chance in ordinary daytime life to walk this slowly through anything, let alone through the private history of women who lived more than a century ago in houses most of us will only ever visit as brief, hurried tourists. Tonight offered exactly that rare chance, and if you have stayed with this story through its many long chapters, you have given something valuable simply by staying, by letting each room hold its own weight for as long as it needed to, rather than hurrying toward whatever grander room waited next. Perhaps this offers one final gentle thought to carry with you as sleep finally arrives. The next time you walk through any old house, any inherited space, any room that holds more history than its surface immediately reveals, whether a grand museum or simply a familiar room in your own life, there might be value in occasionally choosing the slower path, lingering a little longer than strictly necessary at whatever smaller, quieter detail catches your attention, rather than hurrying automatically toward whichever grander thing seems to be waiting next. The house around you now has grown almost entirely silent, its many rooms finally settled into whatever rest an old building can offer after a long evening of quiet, careful attention. There is nothing more to notice tonight, nothing more to walk past or linger over, only this last, settling quiet, carrying you gently toward your own rest, exactly the way it carried every room in tonight's long story toward its own particular, well-earned stillness. A final, quiet accounting before we let tonight's story rest completely. Across this long evening we have walked through the lives of women whose names in most cases survive quite clearly in the historical record, attached to marriages and mansions and financial scandals significant enough to have been documented, reported and eventually preserved in archives that later historians could carefully reconstruct. This is itself worth noticing one final time because it shapes, in ways we should hold honestly, exactly whose stories a story like tonight's is actually able to tell. The women whose names survive most clearly tonight were, in nearly every case, women whose lives intersected with genuinely significant sums of money, sums large enough to generate legal filings, newspaper coverage, and family archives substantial enough to survive a century or more of careful or careless preservation. Their stories, however genuinely difficult and however genuinely worth telling, represent a narrow, privileged slice of the much broader population of women who lived through this same era under considerably more modest circumstances. Somewhere beyond the reach of tonight's story, in households of far more ordinary means, other women built their own versions of everything we have discussed this evening, their own private ledgers, however much smaller in scale, their own quiet grief carried without the benefit of a dedicated sitting room, their own small acts of resistance against husbands and trustees and social expectations, conducted with considerably fewer resources and considerably less documentation than the women whose names we have spoken tonight. Their stories are, by any measure, just as real, just as significant, and almost entirely lost to us. The simple accident of insufficient wealth having denied them the kind of archival survival that preserved so much of what we have discussed this evening. This is worth sitting with gently, one final time, because it offers a useful corrective to any impression tonight's story might have accidentally created, that the particular architecture of concealment we have spent this evening exploring belonged only to the extraordinarily wealthy. It did not. The underlying legal doctrine of coverture applied, in its full formal force, to every married woman across this entire era, regardless of her family's wealth or social position. A shopkeeper's wife in a small Midwestern town lived under exactly the same legal erasure as a railroad heiress on Fifth Avenue, even if her particular version of that erasure generated no newspaper coverage, no legal filing significant enough to survive into any archive, no story detailed enough for a documentary account like tonight's to eventually reconstruct. We can only imagine, with appropriate humility, what her version of tonight's story might have looked like. Perhaps a small tin box rather than a false-bottomed jewellery case, holding whatever modest savings she managed to set aside from her own household allowance. Perhaps a quiet corner of a small kitchen rather than an elaborate sitting room, serving as her own private space for grief that a busy working household offered little other room to express. Perhaps simply the particular privacy of her own thoughts, carried silently through an ordinary working day, the only hidden room available to a woman whose house held no spare rooms at all, to set aside for such purposes. Her story, whatever its specific shape, deserves exactly the same careful, unhurried attention we have given tonight to the women whose names survived clearly enough to anchor a full evening's documentary account. That we cannot offer her that attention with the same specificity, that we can only gesture toward her likely experience through careful, respectful inference rather than through her own actual documented words, is a genuine limitation of tonight's story, one worth acknowledging honestly rather than glossing over as we finally approach the end of this long evening together. Let this acknowledgement settle gently now, alongside everything else we have gathered tonight. Not every name survives. Not every hidden room leaves a trace clear enough for a story like this one to find and describe with confidence. But the underlying human experience, the quiet, patient work of finding whatever small space one can within whatever constraints one's particular era and particular circumstances impose, belong to considerably more women than the relatively small handful whose names we have spoken across tonight's long walk through these grand, well-preserved houses. Wherever you are tonight, whoever came before you in whatever ordinary or extraordinary rooms shaped your own particular history, let this final thought rest alongside you as sleep finally, gently arrives. Somewhere in your own family's past, however modest or however grand, someone very likely built her own small version of exactly what we have spent this evening exploring, a private space, however humble, in which to simply, quietly, be herself, for however brief a window of time her particular life allowed her. That story, whatever its specific shape, deserves to be remembered too, even where its details have long since faded beyond any archive's ability to recover them. Imagine, one final time tonight, the last party ever held in a house like this one, though no one attending it that evening would have known it was the last. Perhaps it was a modest gathering by the standards of the house's grander decades, the family's fortune already quietly diminished, the guest list considerably shorter than it once would have been, though everyone present still made the same careful effort at conversation and composure the era had trained them all to make. The last guest to leave that evening would have walked out through the same grand entrance that had welcomed hundreds of guests across the house's most celebrated years, unaware, most likely, that the house's era as a genuine functioning home was drawing quietly to its close, that within a matter of years it would pass into new hands, or into the careful custody of a preservation society. Its rooms eventually opened not to invited guests, but to paying visitors arriving by the busload. There is something worth sitting with in that ordinary, unremarkable final evening, indistinguishable at the time from 100 other evenings that had come before it. History rarely announces its own turning points clearly while they are actually happening. The women whose stories we have spent tonight exploring lived through what we now recognize as one of American history's most distinctive and most thoroughly studied eras, and yet most of them, on any given ordinary evening, were simply living their lives, managing their households, navigating their particular versions of the concealment and resistance we have traced so carefully tonight, with no particular sense that future audiences would someday gather more than a century later to walk slowly through their private rooms and consider their private struggles with such careful attention. This is worth carrying gently into your own rest tonight. Whatever ordinary evening you're experiencing right now, wherever you are, whatever quiet concerns or quiet comforts fill your own particular version of an ordinary day, you too are living through history in the only way any of us ever actually do, without quite knowing yet which of tonight's ordinary details might someday matter to someone else, in some future evening we cannot yet imagine. There is no need to solve that thought tonight, only to let it settle gently alongside everything else this long evening has offered you. The house has emptied now, its last guest gone, its rooms finally completely quiet, exactly as your own thoughts are settling now into their own quiet, unhurried stillness. One final image, gentler than almost anything else we have discussed tonight, to carry with you as this long story finally closes. We mentioned earlier that the platinum-doored mansion on Fifth Avenue no longer stands, its footprint replaced, quietly and without ceremony, by an ordinary garden, roses growing now where a fortune once performed its most elaborate, ultimately hollow, display of permanence. There is something worth resting in, one last time, about that particular transformation. Not tragedy exactly, though the mansion's collapse certainly held real tragedy within it, for the woman who lived through its unravelling. Something closer, instead, to a quiet, patient correction, the elaborate performance eventually giving way, as elaborate performances so often eventually do, to something simpler and more genuinely alive. Grass grows, roses bloom. The ground itself, indifferent to whatever grandeur or whatever collapse once occupied the space above it, simply continues doing what ground has always done, season after season, regardless of who happens to be building or losing a fortune upon its surface. Let this be the last image tonight's story leaves with you. Whatever grand or complicated architecture any of us build across our own lives, whatever hidden rooms we construct for whatever private reasons feel necessary at the time, the ground beneath all of it remains patient and steady, ready to become, eventually something simpler and quieter, a garden, a stretch of grass, an ordinary place where ordinary things are finally simply allowed to grow undisturbed. Rest now in that same simple readiness. Let whatever elaborate architecture your own day required of you settle quietly back into the ground, and let something simpler take its place for these final hours before morning, undisturbed, unhurried, and entirely gently at peace. Consider, one more time before we finally close this story, everything a single evening's dinner party in one of these grand houses actually concealed beneath its polished surface, because holding this full picture together, all at once in these final quiet minutes, offers a kind of completeness worth sitting with before sleep finally arrives. The hostess descending the staircase in her new gown carried beneath that gown whatever private financial reality her husband had or had not chosen to share with her that particular season, whatever quiet grief she was still privately carrying from a loss society considered her required period of mourning to have already resolved, whatever careful private savings she had patiently built into a hidden drawer against whatever uncertain future she alone had the foresight to prepare for. The husband greeting his guests in the entrance hall carried, beneath his own composed performance, whatever debts he had not yet found the occasion or the courage to disclose, whatever leveraged ambitions he was quietly nursing toward an uncertain outcome, whatever private tenderness toward his own children, he reserved only for quieter rooms, away from the business world's unforgiving expectations of ceaseless strength. The children upstairs in the nursery wing, already asleep or nearly so, carried within them the beginnings of whatever future marriages, whatever future fortunes or future collapses, whatever future private rooms of their own they would eventually need to build, decades from this particular ordinary evening, in houses and circumstances none of the adults downstairs could yet fully imagine. The servants moving invisibly along the back staircases carried the accumulated, largely unspoken knowledge of nearly everything happening in every room of the house, a quiet, comprehensive understanding that the family upstairs, absorbed in their own performance, rarely paused to consider they possessed at all. and the house itself. The marble and the stone and the carefully carved panelling carried all of it together, silently, patiently, the way it has carried every story we have told across this long evening, offering up its rooms tonight not to teach any single lesson, but simply to hold space, unhurried and complete, for the full, complicated humanity of everyone who ever lived within its walls. This is where tonight's story finally rests. Not in any single answer, but in this fuller, gentler picture, every hidden room finally acknowledged together, every private struggle and every private tenderness held, for these last few minutes, in the same patient, unhurried attention. Let it settle now, completely, the way everything else tonight has settled before it. The house is quiet. The candle is out. It is, at last, simply time to sleep. The candle in the hallway where we began tonight has burned down considerably now, its flame low and steady, casting only the faintest light across the panelled wall, where a seam still waits, patient as it has always been, for someone else, some other night, to notice it. You do not need to notice it again tonight. You have already given this house, and the women who once lived within it, more careful attention than most of its daytime visitors ever think to offer. That is enough. It was always enough, simply to walk through slowly, to let each room hold its own particular weight for exactly as long as it needed to, without hurrying toward any conclusion beyond the quiet one settling over you now. Let your shoulders soften completely into whatever surface is holding you. Let your hands rest, open and unclenched, exactly the way a jewel box finally rests once its owner has stopped needing to reach for the key each evening. There is nothing left to manage tonight. No ledger to balance, no letter to hide, no palace to empty. Only this, the simple, unhurried work of finally, completely letting go. Somewhere in this house, a room is holding stillness for you, the way the marble held stillness for 100 years of quiet human drama passing through it. You do not need to find that room. You're already resting inside it, in whatever ordinary room actually surrounds you tonight, far from any Gilded Age mansion, and yet in this particular unhurried moment, not so very far from the same simple human need every woman in tonight's story ultimately shared, a small private space in which to finally fully rest. The house settles once more, a final long exhale through old timber and older stone, and then it is still. The candle gutters low. The seam in the wallpaper disappears into shadow. Whatever this house still holds, it will hold quietly, patiently, exactly as it has held everything else across its long life, waiting without any particular urgency for whenever you might choose to return. You do not need to return tonight. You only need to rest. Let your breathing continue its own slow, steady rhythm, the rhythm the entire house has been gently teaching you across these last several hours, a rhythm with nowhere to hurry toward, nothing left to prove, nothing left to conceal. Just this, just the quiet, just the long, unhurried dark, holding you exactly the way it has always held everything else worth holding. Sleep now. The house will still be here in the morning, every room exactly where you left it, every hidden seam still waiting, patiently, for whenever you're ready to notice it again. For tonight, there is nothing more required of you than this soft, settling stillness, carrying you gently toward whatever rest you have been needing. Feel the weight of your own body now, settled and heavy and entirely supported, the way the marble was always supported by the ground beneath it, the way the telescope was always supported by its patient iron frame, the way every quiet room we visited tonight was always, ultimately, held up by something steadier than itself. You're held too, right now, exactly as completely. There is no ledger to check one final time, no letter to reread, no gown to select for tomorrow. There is only this, the soft dark, the slow breath, the gentle release of a day already finished and a night that asks nothing more of you than to simply fully arrive within it. If you like this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.